Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. Hello there, well, I'm here, one of my writers, in this case David, who's written me a script, Albert Fish. And I know this name because I do another channel called Biographics, and we did a video on this guy, and he's a monster. I'm not swearing this early in the videos, so I can monetize them on YouTube and not make it too much work for Jen, who edits these wonderful things. I mean, these aren't wonderful. Jen does a wonderful job editing. I'd never say that this is... You get what I'm saying.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
I'm trying not to say it like, Blame is a brilliant show, Simon. You're a creative genius. What was I talking about? It doesn't even matter. Look, I've never read this before. Let's jump in. Albert Fish is a monster. Let's go. It's May the 25th, 1928, in the Chelsea district on the island of Manhattan in New York City. The Budd family resided in an apartment at 406 West 15th Street in rather impoverished conditions amid the city squalor. In total, 7 people shared the tiny apartment. The father, Albert Budd, worked as a porter at a life insurance company, which essentially meant that he opened doors and carried things for office workers and executives. His wife, Delia Budd, was a homemaker. Their children were 2 teenagers named Edward and Albert Jr., 2 prepubescent kids named George and Grace, and a 5-year-old named Beatrice. I don't want to sound like mega out of touch right now, but does this still happen? Like in the West? Like I think of like where, Europe, America, places like that. Do people no one lives like 7 people in one small apartment anymore. That was a past thing, right? Or does this still happen? I'm sounding mega out of touch, but I feel like cramming like 700 people into a tiny apartment was definitely like, in my mind, that was the Victorian times while the children work in the mines and stuff. Or am I just out of touch? Does anyone live with like, because people had like 1 million children, right? Great start to the show. You're really making people like you already, Simon. Well done. Edward Budd, age 18, supplemented his father's income by working part-time as a truck driver. Getting sick of the filthy city and tiring of living at close quarters with his family, Edward decided that he needed a change of scenery. He therefore took out a 1-line classified ad in the New York World newspaper, which read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in the country." If I got this email, like generally people email me like,
hey, can I do this? Can I do that? Do you need someone to do this? Do you need someone to do that?
Generally the pictures are quite good. Like they're like, hey, I've got this girl, I've got this girl. Most of them, I have to say, I just ignore because I get a lot of them and I don't need a lot of people. But so if someone sent me this and be like, young man, 18, wishes position in YouTube editing or whatever, I'll be like, what? No CV? No portfolio? No nothing? Archive. On May the 27th, Budd's classified ad appeared in the Sunday edition. Elsewhere in the city, it was read by a man who liked to molest, torture, murder, mutilate, and eat young boys. Yes, as I mentioned, this episode gets rather dark. The next day, May the 18th at 3:30 p.m., the man showed up at the Budd residence and politely knocked on the door. Delia Budd answered it. The man was approximately 5'7" or 170 centimeters. He was neatly dressed in a suit and a hat, which he doffed deferentially to Mrs. Budd. His teeth were stained a mixture of yellow and brown. We'll let that slide. It's the past. The man had just turned 58, although he looked as though he was considerably older due to his extreme skeletal frame, his gaunt face, his white moustache, his white temples, and his balding mop of grey hair parted neatly on the left. His face was creased with careworn lines with large, heavy bags under his eyes. That hard living can really... I don't know what this guy's been up to. I mean, other than eating young boys. But it ages people. The one that I'm quite grateful that I've always been like one of those people who put sun cream on like all the time. Even when I was a kid, I was like, I don't like getting burned. I don't like going out in the sun. I've always been a basement dweller. And then you see people who've tanned and stuff. And it's like, they get old so young. It's great. They'll be like 35 and it's like, what's happened to your face?
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, you are ugly.
It's like, yeah, tanning beds. Why? Why do you do this to yourself? The stats on tanning beds are mental. Isn't it like you go for tanning one time and it increases your odds of getting skin cancer by something like 70%? I'm not sure if that's true, but it's nuts if it is. And I was walking through the city the other day and there was a big neon sign at like a tanning parlor, which I can't believe are something that's still legal, by the way. Like if you want to do that in your own home and stuff, fine. Buy a tanning bed, you idiot. But like for there to be establishments where you can go to and make yourself brown and massively increase your chances of getting skin cancer, which is then a drain on the health system, is mental. But there was a big neon sign that says, "There's never been a better time to tan." And I'm like, this is crazy that you can advertise this. It's like advertising smoking, which is still a thing. But you get what I mean. Wow, we really got into that from that, Simon. You're going to be here forever. This script's already very long. It's 35 bloody pages, and the font is small. The type? The font? It's small, okay? It's a long script. Even his demeanor seemed perpetually fatigued. This was a man who, under the rigors of existence, had aged before his time. Looking at him, one might say the man could be anywhere from between 60 to 100. And a witness once said of the man, quote, "Everything about him seemed faded and grey." This appearance produced one of the man's many nicknames, the Grey Man. He identified himself to Mrs. Budd as Frank Howard and explained that he had seen Edward Budd's classified ad and he wanted to offer the young man a job working on his farm. Mrs. Budd explained that Edward was visiting a friend at the moment and the 5-year-old Beatrice was promptly dispatched to go and fetch him. Mrs. Budd offered Frank Howard a glass of freshly squeezed lemonade while he waited. Frank Howard, in his usual genteel manner, politely accepted. Within a few minutes, Edward Budd arrived with his friend Willie Corman. Both boys were 18 years old. Both were solidly built and muscular. Frank Howard took note of this. He's like, lately my son, everywhere he goes, he's like he's just constantly thinking about food. He's a little fat kid as well. He's not fat, he's just like chubby. And my daughter's like so skinny. It's like they're complete opposites. And he's always like wandering around being like he's one, and it is like his way of indicating that he wants food or something, and he's constantly doing it like and it just reminds me of this dude seeing these two muscular boys and being like, what's wrong with me, Jesus? Frank Howard took note of this. They would not be easily overpowered by a skinny aging man such as himself, but he decided to try. Well, he's got the elements of surprise, hasn't he? Because like, it doesn't matter how muscular you are, if someone comes up from behind you with a hammer and whacks you over the head, that's it, isn't it?
Yes, pretty much.
Howard explained that he was a wealthy interior decorator from Washington, D.C. He said that 11 years ago he'd purchased a farm on Long Island, near a place called Farmingdale, no less. Creative. Howard moved there with his wife and 6 children to live, but a year after arriving, Howard's wife had left him for another man. This left Howard to raise 6 children by himself. Happily, they'd all grown up to be decent adults and moved away. One of his sons, Howard said proudly, was a cadet at West Point. Meanwhile, under Frank Howard's wise tutelage, the farm had prospered. The place boasted 300 chickens, 6 cows, and was usually staffed by 5 farmhands and a Swedish cook. However, Howard explained one of the farmhands had just quit and he was looking for a replacement. Howard offered to pay Edward Budd $15 per week, which is roughly $260 in modern money. Isn't that that's like $1,000 a month? That's not particularly good, is it? This is America. I know it's like it's 100 years ago, so you can't really transfer the money, but you couldn't live off $1,000 a month in America, could you? Probably not. America's so expensive. I brought this up before. I haven't been in a few years, but I remember going and it's been like, oh my God, it's really expensive here. And it used to be cheap. Like I went back in 2008 and the pound was like, you got $2 to your pound. And me and my mate were like, whoa, things are really cheap in America. I go back like 10 years later and you're like, oh my God, what happened? Everything's now really expensive. Edward Budd then asked Frank Howard if he would also hire his friend Willie Corman. Howard agreed. Then the Grey Man said he was off to New Jersey on business and would return on June the 2nd with a car to drive the 2 young men out to Farmingdale. The 18-year-olds and Mrs. Delia Budd were thrilled at the opportunity. The wages were fair, room and board was included, and the 2 young men would be able to save a bit of cash from some honest work. Yeah, that's okay then. It's like, if you're 18 and you're making, that seems like decent money if they're also paying for your living, because then it's just savings, isn't it? On June the 2nd, Frank Howard did not turn up with his car. At 4 p.m., the Budd family received a telegram which said that Howard was detained in New Jersey and would arrive the next morning. Just before 12 p.m. on June the 3rd, Frank Howard arrived at the Budds' apartment having taken the subway rather than driving a car. He knocked on the door, which was answered by Delia Budd. Frank Howard gave Delia a punnet of strawberries and a packet of cheese, which Howard claimed were fresh from his farm. In actual fact, they'd been purchased at a Manhattan street market not far away. Mrs. Budd told Frank Howard that her son, Edward, would be home soon, and she invited Howard to join the family for lunch. Howard then noticed the telegram he had sent the Budds the previous day was sitting on the mantelpiece of the fireplace. Mrs. Budd thought it was odd that Howard walked up to it and quietly slid it into his jacket pocket. She did not comment on it, though. I'd be like, hey, that's mine. I know you sent it, but that's my letter. Leave it alone. Put it back, you weird man. At lunch, Delia and Frank Howard were joined by the father of the family, Albert Budd, 5-year-old Beatrice, and 10-year-old Grace. Edward had not yet returned home. As the family ate, Frank had to, where do they eat? There's like so many of them in a tiny apartment. I can't, how they got a giant dining room table? As the family ate, Frank Howard turned his attention to Grace Budd. Howard asked the young girl to sit on his knee. I guess this was the past, but what the fuck?
Come over here, child.
Don't do that. If you're a child, don't go sit on strange men's knees. I'm sure like 90% of the time, that's just innocent old person shit, but 10%, it's probably not 10% of the time. But just don't do it. Don't do it. The older man chatted to Grace while he stroked her face and hair. Okay, don't do that. He asked Grace to give him a kiss. No. How old was Grace? I've forgotten, she was young. 10-year-old? No. Howard then reached into his pocket and produced a number of dollar bills and coins, asking 10-year-old Grace to impress him with her math skills by counting them. Grace did so successfully. As a reward, Howard gave Grace 50 cents to buy candy. The girl's parents tolerated this display because Howard seemed like a kindly old man, and he was, after all, Edward Budd's soon-to-be employer. And indeed, notions of stranger danger and... I'm not sure about this word, but it begins with a P and ends in a files. You can probably guess what it is from context. But I think that's one of those words that will get me demonetized on YouTube. And look, I'm going to try desperately hard to make money on this video because it's absolutely massively long and it's about a man who eats children. So the odds of this happening are like 1%. I should just give up. But I'm going to try. I'm sorry. I want to get paid for my efforts. David needs to get paid. Jen needs to get paid. We have to make money, YouTube. Bear with me.
If I take you on,
I promise I'll work so hard.
Lurking around every corner in those days were less prevalent. It was at this point that the Grey Man shifted his plans from Edward Budd and Willie Corman to 10-year-old Grace Budd as his target. Edward and Willie were too old and hardly retained any of the slim, boyish neoteny of adolescence. Learning a new word today. Neoteny. Look up. Also called juvenilization. Oh, that's helpful. Thank you so much. You don't know the word neoteny, so it gives you juvenilization. The delaying or slowing of this physiological or somatic development of an organism, typically an animal. All right, Big Brain Dictionary. Just say it's about... boyish is fine. We could just use boyish, David. They were also extremely well built, which to the Grey Man was both sexually unattractive and a potential problem for their upcoming murders. The adorable Grace Budd, on the other hand, was a girl, to be sure, but she had not yet hit puberty. In many ways, she still resembled a young boy. Indeed, young girls and boys were so indistinguishable that the Grey Man had no problem molesting prepubescent girls many times before. And so, according to the Grey Man's perverse desires and hideous train of thought, Grace Budd would do nicely. Very nicely indeed. Oh, we're on page 2, and I know how bad this gets. Edward Budd and Willie Corman arrived thinking on his feet. Frank Howard explained to the young men that he had to go to his niece's birthday party in New York that afternoon. When it was over, he'd pick up Edward and Willie that evening and take them out to Farmingdale. As a way of an apology for the delay, he gave Edward and Willie $2 and then told them to go to the cinema while they waited for him to return. Frank Howard then proposed that he take Grace to his niece's birthday party to enjoy the games, sweets, and play with the other children. Just say no. Frank Howard, Albert Fish, the Grey Man, looks like a weird old man. Don't let him take your children anywhere. But guess what happens? Howard said they'd return by 9 p.m. at the latest. Delia and Albert Budd asked where the party was being held. Howard replied 137th Street and Columbus Avenue, a bogus address because Columbus Avenue ended at 110th Street. As unthinkable as this may seem to modern ears, Delia and Albert gave their consent. The Grey Man had primed them well. There's no f***ing shot I would ever let this happen. There is absolutely... I'd be like, are you insane? Of course not. Get out of my house. Never ask that question again. The last Delia Budd saw of her 10-year-old daughter Grace was walking up 15th Street, holding hands with the Grey Man until they turned a corner and were out of sight. On 14th Street and 9th Avenue, the Grey Man picked up a small package and left at a newsstand. Concealed within the package were a butcher's knife, cleaver, and handsaw, which the Grey Man privately referred to as his, quote, implements of hell. Then the Grey Man and Grace Budd traveled 20 miles or 30 kilometers north of Manhattan to the small town of Irvington. He had purchased Grace a one-way ticket. The Grey Man almost left his package on the train until Grace helpfully pointed out that he'd forgotten it on his seat. The Grey Man took Grace to the abandoned Wysteria cottage on 359 Mountain Road, having picked it out some weeks earlier as a second location to do what he pleased with his victims. Chasing shadows. When 9 p.m. came and went, the Budd family became extremely alarmed. Early the next morning, Edward Budd fetched the police and brought them back to his parents' apartment. A horrified Delia and Albert Budd discovered that 137th Street and Columbus Avenue did not exist. Edward Budd and Willie Corman were taken to the station to go through a book of photographs of criminals and suspected child predators to see if the so-called Frank Howard was among them. He was not. Meanwhile, an effort was made to track down the telegram which the Grey Man had sent to the Budd household on June the 2nd. The telegram had been sent from 103rd Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, not New Jersey, but nobody at the telegram office could identify the real name of its sender. And sure enough, there was no farm on Long Island owned by a Frank Howard who matched the Grey Man's description. The only Frank Howard the police came across in their investigation was one from Farmingdale, New Jersey, who had sold his farm in 1913, moved to Chicago, and then died in 1918. Yeah, it sounds like he just stole this guy's identity, basically. I'm kind of surprised he didn't just make it up. I mean, it's too much of a coincidence for it not to be a stolen identity. I mean, how big's... New Jersey is a whole state, right? That's not a city. New Jersey's a state. The Garden State, from that movie Garden State with Zach Braff. Great movie, by the way. Great soundtrack.
Thanks, Simon. Great tangent.
On June the 5th, 1928, Grace Budd's disappearance hit the newspapers, and the Budd family and their supporters did all that was left. Searched the city for any sign of the young girl or her abductor. People claimed they spotted Grace Budd and the Grey Man all over New York State, from locations as far afield as Niagara Falls. I like that David's included a pronunciation guide for Niagara. Look, I get that my pronunciation's not always perfect, but Niagara?
I trust no one.
I'm saying it right? Niagara. Niagara Falls. It's super famous. I've been there. Older men in the Budds neighborhood were harassed. 59-year-old Joe Slowey was arrested for talking to a 10-year-old boy in the hallway of their mutual apartment building. The charges were dropped 2 days later. Another group of old men were attacked by a panicked mother for trying to buy the young boy a new bell for his tricycle. Meanwhile, the publicity of Grace's disappearance prompted the Budd family to receive all sorts of macabre and sick messages from pranksters, emotional sadists, and the mentally ill. One letter read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Budd, your daughter is going to a funeral. I still got her. Howard." What is wrong with people? Who's the sort of person who sees something like this happening? He's like, you know what, I'm going to prank them. What the fuck's wrong with you? Like, do you remember YouTube pranks used to be a big thing? And there'd be so many fake pranks and stuff, but they were always mostly harmless. This is like, but kind of, not nice. This is just like different level of, you've got to be a big psycho to be like, let's mess with the people who've had their child abducted. Another letter arrived 11 days after Grace Budd's abduction, which read, "I have Grace. She is safe and sound. She is happy in her new home and not at all homesick. I will see to it Grace has proper schooling. I have given her an Angora cat and a canary named Bill. I am a keen student of human nature. That is why I was attracted to Grace. She seemed like a girl who would appreciate nice surroundings and a real nice home. I drove past your house with Grace in an automobile several days back. I will see to it in the near future that some arrangements are made so Grace can visit you for a short time. J.F.H." No such arrangements were ever made. By the end of June, Grace Budd's case had faded from the newspapers. In August, police identified a suspect named Albert Cortel, a con man who fit the Grey Man's description and had recently been released from prison after serving 4 years for embezzlement. He was known to hire young girls to pose as his daughters during his scams, but he was not known as a child rapist or a murderer. Why did you suspect? Oh, because he matched the description. It sounds like this guy's just like a con man. He's like hiring these girls as part of a fraud, not because he's a weirdo. When confronted with Cortel's photo, Delia Budd swore up and down that this is the Grey Man. The rest of the Budd family weren't so sure. Meanwhile, Cortel had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of Grace for years. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and forced the Budds to move to a new address. In March 1930, they received a package in the mail bizarrely containing a copy of the Christian Science Monitor with no explanatory note. Is that a magazine? A newspaper? However, Delia Budd felt that the return address scrawled on the package resembled her daughter's handwriting. The newspaper had been mailed from New Hampshire by one Herbert J. Sherry. Detectives headed to New Hampshire, and it turned out that Sherry was too young, did not match the description. At the time of Grace's disappearance, he had been imprisoned for deserting from the US Navy. Shortly thereafter, a handwriting expert had determined that the writing on the package was not in fact a match for Grace Budd's. Wait, weren't they like, why did you send this magazine? Why did you mail this? What's the reason? They didn't even ask? It's like, weird people just mailing magazines, okay, or newspapers. In June 1930, police got another lead. A middle-aged man named Charles Howard had recently married into a wealthy New York family, and Howard and his wife were living in an apartment on 2nd Avenue. However, Charles Howard had disappeared, stealing $3,800 from his wife and aunt-in-law, or $68,000 in modern money. Holy dude. Police suspected that Howard was actually the con man, Albert Cortel. Charles Howard was arrested in Florida for grand larceny on June the 10th. What is grand larceny? Is that like big time stealing? What is larceny? Why don't I know what larceny is? It sounds very American, doesn't it? Larceny. Theft. Okay. Big theft. It turned out that Howard wasn't caught all, yet once again Delia Budd swore up and down that she recognized Charles Howard as the grey man who abducted her daughter. Calm down. We've already established you're rubbish at identifying people. You must have that disease. Propapagnosia, something like that. The one where you can't recognize faces properly. But it turned out that Charles Howard had been living on the other side of the country in June 1928 when Grace had been abducted. It was becoming quite clear that in her desperation to find her daughter, Mrs. Budd was grasping onto any lead that she could find and pointing a finger at anybody who vaguely hit the grey man's description. This is stupid because I don't want to be put like... She's in obviously like a lot of emotional distress or whatever, but it's not helpful if you keep identifying people like this because then they're going to be chasing down leads that are incorrect rather than out looking for, but I guess she doesn't know. She's not doing it on purpose, obviously. In another suspect lineup, Delia Budd misidentified an officer who worked in the NYPD's missing persons unit. On September the 3rd, 1930, a woman named Jessica Pope accused her estranged husband, Charles Pope, of abducting Grace Budd. Jessica Pope claimed that her husband met with her on June the 3rd, 1928 in New Jersey with a little girl who fit Grace's description. According to Jessica Pope, her husband had said that the little girl was a daughter of a friend who was traveling. He asked Jessica to look after her for him. Jessica, who was living separately from her husband, refused. According to Jessica's testimony, Charles Pope reluctantly said that he'd have to look after the girl himself. Jessica claimed she forgot about the incident until she suddenly connected the little girl to the Grace Budd case 2 years later. It is interesting how you have these like sudden realizations where you're just like, I see. Like I sometimes have this at work with like something I'm doing and then you'll just be like, it's just like for no reason. You'll just be in the shower and be like, I love those moments. Unless it's something bad. And then you're like, The next day, September the 4th, Charles Pope was arrested for the kidnapping of Grace Budd. Delia Budd managed to identify Pope from a police lineup. Oh, we can't trust Delia with a bloody lineup. She's just guessing. She's like, number 3, number 2, number 5. Step forward. Do they actually do that? My wife, have I told this story before? She did a police lineup. She had her phone nicked. Like she was in a Starbucks and some dude comes up to her and asks for I must have told this story before. I'm sorry if I have. I'll just repeat it real quick. She's in Starbucks. Some dude comes up, nicks her phone. She goes to the police to get the police report so she can get the insurance on it or whatever. Not expecting the police to actually do anything because it's a, theft of a phone. And it turns out that her phone, this guy was like on a run of stealing phones and they'd arrested him. And apparently the value of the phone was above some limit. So it became like bigger theft or whatever. Like it was, I don't know, like an expensive phone or whatever. And so it was like above some limit. And along with all the other thefts, they said they bring her in, there's a lineup. And she's like, yeah, it's going number 3. And he goes to jail. I was like, holy shit, this actually happens. I was so surprised that the police did something and someone actually got punished for a crime. I mean, I think he went to jail or he got like some criminal thing, like he was prosecuted. Charles Pope claimed that he was innocent and that his estranged wife had made the whole thing up out of spite. Police searched Pope's old farmhouse in the Catskills and found some locks of brown hair in an old trunk matching Grace Budd's hair color and some children's stockings which Delia Budd claimed were the same ones worn by Grace on the day she disappeared. I don't think this is the guy, right? But this is looking very bad for you, dude. The case went to trial on December the 22nd, 1930. On the stand, Jessica Pope admitted that she'd once attempted to get her husband committed to an insane asylum so she could get her hands on his money. That's not looking good for the prosecution, is it? Because she's becoming, is it an unreliable witness or whatever? Like where they poke holes in it and it's like, you're not very honest, are you? Are you being honest about this as well? Meanwhile, Delia Budd recanted her claim that the stockings matched the ones worn by Grace on the day of her abduction. Delia Budd also admitted that prior to identifying Charles Pope in the lineup, she had spoken to his wife, Jessica, who had given her a detailed description of her husband's. Oh, what's going on? This Jessica woman seems horrible. She's just trying to frame her husband so he could like get out of her life and she could get his money. Jessica, you need to go to prison in this story. What the fuck? As for the locks of hair, Charles Pope claims they were taken in childhood from his now adult son as keepsakes. Pope also explained that he had collected the stockings from the apartment building he worked at as a janitor to give one of his 5 grandchildren. It was the Depression after all. Yeah, fair. These are fairly good excuses. I've got locks of hair at home. It was weird. Went to get my kid's haircut for the first time. And they're like, oh, it's the first haircut. So they put a little piece of hair that they cut off in this plastic bag and stick it to a piece of paper that says first haircut. And I'm like, that's something I'll hold on to for years. And then my kids will just end up thrown away when they're like 20. Because that's what happens to everything. And then eventually I'll die and all my stuff will get thrown away. The circle of life.
my god, not again.
After only a day's trial, Charles Pope was found not guilty. Only Jessica Pope continued to insist on her estranged husband's guilt. As a result of his wife's actions, Charles Pope had spent 108 days in jail while he had been denounced in the newspapers as a dangerous child predator. If that was me, I would sue. Well, she doesn't have any money, so what are you supposed to do? There's gotta be some crime there. Like, she was coaching a witness to identify the dude in a lineup. I'd be like, police, do something about this. And if she had any money, I'd be suing her ass so fast. Meanwhile, in December, the conman Albert Courtauld was arrested in Missouri for trying to cash a bogus check for $15,000 or $269,000 in today's money. Yeah, they're gonna check that. That's a big check. Under questioning, Courtauld admitted to being in New York in June 1928, but he denied having anything to do with the abduction of Grace Budd. Police could not find any evidence directly linking Courtauld to the girl. Meanwhile, Delia Budd, having learned her lesson about wishfully misidentifying suspects at last, Delia said that Courtauld did not match her memory of the Grey Man. The kidnapping charge against Courtauld was dropped, and the case of Grace Budd went cold for a further 4 years. Letter from a lunatic. On June the 4th, 1934, after 6 years of searching with no solid police leads, the Budd family received a letter from a Brooklyn housewife named Adele Miller. She had sent the Budds a newspaper clipping about the US battleship Colorado. Okay, which featured a photograph of a dark-haired teenage girl smiling at the camera accompanied by 2 sailors. Adele Miller circled the photograph, drew an arrow next to it, and wrote the words, "This is the girl, Grace Budd." The Budd family took the newspaper clipping to the police, and an appeal was made in the press to find the girl. Within a few days, the girl in question showed up at a police station. Turns out that this was Florence Swinney, a 16-year-old girl who lived in the Bronx. After the crushing disappointment, Delia Budd lost all hope that she'd ever find out what happened to her daughter. Yeah, I've been ragging on Delia a little bit, but also I cannot possibly imagine being in this situation. It would be unbelievable. Like the parents of Madeleine McCann. Have we covered Madeleine McCann on this channel? I think we have, because I feel like I know that story quite well now. I cannot possibly imagine the trauma and the grief and the stress of just not knowing. God damn. I don't even like to think about it, so let's just move on. But elsewhere in the city, sitting at his kitchen table, the Grey Man was reading the newspaper appeals, attempting to locate the girl who was hopefully Grace Budd. In one of the stories, the Grey Man noticed they had published the Budd's new mailing address. Several months later, on November the 2nd, 1934, the sole remaining detective assigned to the Grace Budd case, William F. King, planted a bogus story in the New York Daily Mirror in a desperate attempt to keep interest in the case alive and to keep the tips flowing in. The idea was eventually that one of them had to pan out. Detective King paid gossip columnist Walter Winchell to write a story about how the police had located a witness, a cocaine addict from Randall's Island, who knew about the disappearance and said he knew where the girl's body was buried. Needless to say, there was no cocaine-addicted tipster. Detective King had simply made up the story. Elsewhere in New York, the coverage again caught the attention of the Grey Man. 10 days later, on November the 12th, 1934, Delia Budd received an anonymous letter in the mail. Delia was illiterate, so she asked her son Edward, now 24 years old, to read it to her. Quote, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep the others from starving. Oh my lord, is that true? A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and had just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which was the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long that he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, and burned everything they had on. Several times, every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. Oh my god, this is so fucked up. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and, of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next. Went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was. I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Oh my god, it's at that moment that you know he's telling the truth. assuming that information wasn't public. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. I know this story was going to get bad, but it's like, Jesus, it's a kid. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and run downstairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratched. I choked her to death, then cut her up in small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have, had I wished. She died a virgin. Jesus Christ, I have no words.
I'm too messed up. I need therapy.
The Budd family had received a number of letters from vindictive, cruel, and mentally ill people saying all sorts of twisted things about Grace over the years, but this one was different. This one had been written by the Grey Man himself. Meet Albert Fish. Hamilton Howard Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May the 19th, 1870. His father, Randall Fish, was actually born in the 18th century in 1795, having been 75 at the time of his son's birth. Oh man, what are you up to? It's like, didn't like Al Pacino just have a kid and he's like 106? And you're like, I mean, he's not 106, but you get what I mean. It's like, that kid's never going to really know you. You're definitely going to be dead by the time he's like a teenager, right? Or you're going to be a super old man. You're already a super old man. His mother, Ellen Fish, was initially a homemaker. She was 32 when she gave birth to her son, a full 43 years younger than her husband. Hamilton Howard Fish was the youngest of 3 older siblings, Walter, Anne, and Edwin. 3 older siblings. They, like, given how old his dad is, they could be his dad. Randall was impressively virile for his age. Prior to Hamilton's birth, Randall and Ellen had another child, Albert, who died in infancy from hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus? I think we say hydrocephalus. David's included a pronunciation guide, but I believe it hydrocephalus? I'm not sure. I think because Ceph is pronounced Kef in the UK. Like, what's that common one? Encephalopathy or whatever it is. It's not encephalopathy. I'm not sure. It doesn't matter. Let's move on. Which is an excess of fluid in the cavities of the brain, which caused it to swell, inflicting numerous mental and physical disabilities, and in baby Albert's case, death. Hamilton Howard Fish was named after a distant relative who was US Secretary of State under President Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. As Hamilton grew up, however, he came to dislike the name since other children began calling him Ham and Eggs, so Hamilton adopted the name of his dead brother Albert and insisted that everyone call him that instead. That's going to be weird for your parents. The name Albert Fish stuck, and this is the name that this future torturer, murderer, and cannibal became known to history by. Albert Fish's father, Randall, had for many years captained a riverboat along the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and had already lived a full life with a previous wife and children. Randall's first wife had died of an unspecified illness. Then, as America industrialized in the mid-19th century, Randall Fish transitioned into fertilizer manufacturing, investing a large amount of his life savings as capital. The business took off, and the resulting increase in Randall's income permitted him to marry a considerably younger wife in her 20s when he was in his mid-60s. Then, in true 19th century style, Randall and the young Ellen began vigorously pumping out more babies. That is the last thing I'd want to do in my mid-60s. I mean, I did this already. I don't want to do it again. It's already hard when I'm young. I can't imagine doing this in my 60s. My parents are in their 60s. I cannot imagine them having any possible desire to do this. Like, not that it's not wonderful and life-affirming and all of that but it's also a lot of work. I'm tired all the time. I woke up at 5:30 this morning for no reason. The kids were just like,
Hey, Dad, I've had enough sleep.
and it's like, well, I haven't. Doing that in my 60s would be not a good time. It was, however, a somewhat unfortunate gene pool with a history of mental illness on both sides of the family. Randall's brother was locked up in a state mental asylum for having delusions that God was talking to him. I feel like a lot of people have this though, don't they? It's like, God told me to. It's like, did he though? What's that famous quote? If you talk to God, that's fine. If God talks to you, that's a problem. Who said that?
Jesus Christ.
I can't remember. It's a good quote though, isn't it? He was never released and he died there. It's highly likely he was schizophrenic. One of Randall's sisters was not locked up in an asylum, but was generally considered by her family to be quote unquote completely crazy. One of Randall's... Oh, that's cousin Jill, she's completely crazy. One of Randall's sons, so harsh. She's an absolute nut job. One of Randall's sons from his previous marriage also wound up in a mental asylum with unspecified symptoms and died there. Meanwhile, Albert Fish's mother, Ellen, was considered quote-unquote very queer and was said to have regular auditory and visual hallucinations. I get the feeling it's the, odd meaning of queer here rather than the more modern meaning. Thanks for clarifying that, Simon. No one was sure. Finally, Albert's sister Anne was also said to have some sort of quote-unquote mental affliction. The state of this rather gnarled family tree did not bode well for Albert himself. No, it didn't, and we know what he becomes. But it got worse. On October the 16th, 1875, when Albert Fish was just 5 years old, his father, Randall, dropped dead from a heart attack at the Baltimore and Potomac Railway Station in Washington, D.C. Yeah, because he's an old-ass man. He's going to be like 70. And it's like, that's fine. Like, 70's not that old. You're going to live, like, you could, what's the average age? Like 80-something? So you got another good 10 years. But this was the past. He should have been dead already. Ellen Fish, then 38, was a housewife, and Randall had not left her any financial savings for her to raise kids without an income. What are you up to, Randall? When you're popping out kids at 65 with your young wife and you've got money, how are you not thinking this through? How's your wife not, what's his name?
Randall, have you thought about what happens when you inevitably die, you old man?
He's like, not really. I think we just spend all our money. So what the fuck? In those days, there was not much in the way of welfare support for single mothers, and Ellen did not have family members in a financial position to help her out. Thus, Ellen Fish was forced to offload young Albert onto St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. Randall, you irresponsible. Like, I think about this and I'm 36, just turned 36. And I'm like, well, yeah. Like, because I'm the primary breadwinner, and if I die suddenly, it's like, it's like my wife's like, she hasn't worked in a couple of years because she's had kids and stuff. And it's like, I don't want her to suddenly have to go back to work and stuff like immediately. People think about this. If you haven't thought about this, think about this. It can happen. People die, especially if you're an old ass man. According to Albert Fish's own account, while at the orphanage, he was physically abused, not an unlikely thing in an age that condoned fairly severe corporal punishment. To quote, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's when I got started wrong. Sister Sarah, about 30 years old, had a cord with a hairbrush and a whip like a riding crop. For the least offence, laughing or talking, she'd pull down our pants and whip our bare behinds, often drew blood. Often in the bathroom, she would strip us completely naked to whip us. Toward the latter part of my stay there, I got hard when she did it. Oh my, I know she enjoyed it. The bigger boys used to go to her room late at night. I got excited when she whipped others too. I used to get pleasure from seeing how red their behinds got. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." Fish recounts one event shortly after arriving at the orphanage where some of the older boys caught an old horse which had been wandering in a nearby field. They tied it to a fence post, then they poured kerosene on the horse's tail and lit it on fire. These guys. You know how there's the list for like sexual predators or whatever? There should be a list for kids who torture animals. It's like, it's not bad. I mean, the sexual predator one is obviously like, that's a list of bad people. But there should also just be this quiet list of potentially bad people who maybe we should just keep a bit of a closer eye on, like people who set horses on fire, for example. The boys cut the rope, tying it to the fence, letting the horse stampede away, trying to escape the fire, which of course it could not. The panicked horse ran around frantically, crashing through numerous fences as its tail was immolated by flames. Is there anything in a horse's tail other than hair? Because in that case, it's like tail's going to burn off, but it's not going to have some I mean, it's obviously going to get its like arse burnt a little bit, but it's not like a kangaroo tail, is it? There's not like... How do I not know this? There's no like bony, sticky outy bit on a horse, is there? Like in the tail bit. I'm pretty sure there's not. I think it's just hair. It's like a bit of a, like it's mane, but for the arse. Right? How do I not know this? Should ask ChatGPT. Is there a tail on a horse? Like, is there a bone in its tail? ChatGPT would be like, no, you dumb. While we cannot be sure Fish regularly partook in cruelty towards animals himself, like many serial killers do in their childhoods, the event with the horse did stick in his memory. Quote, "That horse, that's me, a man of passion. The fire chases you and catches you, and then it's in your blood. And after that, it's the fire that has control, not the man. Blame the fire of passion for what Albert H. Fish has done." Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Let's blame the fire. That's separate from you, Albert. It's not your fault. It's just, I don't know, your being that's doing this. Seriously, dude? And what has Albert Fish done? Sometimes I myself am not sure what is real and what is not, what I've really done and what are things I wanted to do, and things I thought about doing for so long that it got to be as if I had done them. so that I'd remember them just as clearly as the real things, just as clearly as that hot Sunday in June when I went to the window and whistled to that little Grace Budd, and she stopped picking daisies and came inside. Contemporary psychiatrists concluded that due to Albert's physical abuse in the orphanage, he developed a penchant for masochism. He began to enjoy getting whipped by the custodians of the orphanage as a way of processing what was happening to him. At age 7, the beatings began to give Fish erections, for which the other orphans teased him. I always thought, if you wanted to choose spies should be masochistic, right? Because if they ever get captured, they'll be like, oh no, what are you going to do?
Oh, behave.
Are you going to torture me for information? What a shame! I'm not looking forward to that at all. I'll have to give it all up, but I'll work really hard on not giving it up while you tear my fingernails out, which I'm not going to absolutely love. That's what spies, that should be like a primary recruitment thing for spies, because then even if they're and they get caught, they're still not going to reveal any information. Could they be like, oh no, not another fingernail? Once Fish hit puberty, that masochism was heavily sexualized and deeply ingrained into how regularly he achieved arousal. Much of Albert Fish's masturbatory fantasies consisted of him being the victim of extreme and degrading pain. But masochism was not the only product of his childhood. Albert also developed a strong impulse towards sexual sadism, particularly toward young boys, largely due to Albert's ability to empathize with the pain being inflicted, imagining what it would feel like, and consequently growing aroused. To quote Fish himself, I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and to have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt, and the desire to inflict pain, that is all that is uppermost. Albert Fish was also bisexual, erring heavily on the side of favoring males. Most of his sexual fantasies involved young boys, but he could also achieve arousal with prepubescent girls who resembled boys. Fish was undoubtedly a pedo word, and possibly also an ephebophile. Ephebophile? I've never heard of that. Sexual attraction towards teens. Well, that's also a P word, isn't it? We don't need a separate word for that. That's still being a P word. But he was not particularly attracted to adult men or women. However, Fish did enjoy sending sexually grotesque letters to women, masturbating to the thought of their shock and horror at the impropriety, rather than gaining sexual satisfaction from imagining the woman's physical attributes themselves. This practice may have been the result of humiliation, sexual or otherwise, inflicted on Fish by female staff during his time at the orphanage, whenever Fish was punished for breaking the rules. I imagine it's a combination of all of these things. Like, one, he's obviously coming from, we went through his entire family tree of mental disease, which was significant. So I think it's like you take that and then you sprinkle in a little bit of up childhood and bingo, Albert Fish eating children. Don't fuck up your kids. He also occasionally tried to manipulate female correspondents into describing how they would inflict corporal punishment on naughty children, imagining himself in their place. Otherwise, the preferred subjects of Fish's sexual fantasies were children, usually involving Fish torturing them or the children torturing him. However, at a pinch, Fish could also achieve sexual arousal from imagining that he was torturing or being tortured by male teenagers who still retained their last vestiges of their boyishness. Furthermore, Fish was generally timid and meek around other adults, and it was only with young children that he felt the power dynamic was enough in his favor to indulge in his predatory behavior. He was a lot more animated and even friendlier with children than he was with adults, but that liberality of feeling could also take a dark turn when he was alone with them. This phenomenon is common enough among P-words, so much so that in the modern day, a man could be respected for being good with children, but he is quickly made an object of suspicion if he is quote-unquote too good with children, or a little overeager to be in their company. Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it? I don't know, before I had kids, I didn't know really how to interact with kids. I'd be like, hello, children. What are you up to? And it with because I got cousins and stuff who were born before my kids, and it was always I don't know what to do with children. What do you do? How do you play? And now I have my own kids, and it's oh, okay, now I get it. And it's just oh, isn't it nice? They're just like mine, except less nice because they're not mine. But now I understand it. And it's although if there's a kid who's a couple of years older, I'm I don't know what you like. I don't know who, as soon as any kid, mine or younger, it's cool. Got that experience. Now how to interact with. Any kids older, I'm just Just like before, still don't know. In early 1879, Ellen Fish got a job working for the US government in Washington, which allowed her to afford to look after her children again. According to Fish, she told him, "Getting you back from the orphanage was like getting my son back from the dead." Fish returned to live with her after spending ages 5 to 9 being regularly abused. Aside from his vague memories as a toddler, most of his lived experience of the world had been in an environment of fairly brutal and consistent mistreatment at the hands of adults who were supposed to care for him. It is therefore unsurprising that, as an adult himself, Fish felt driven to replicate this abuse by inflicting it on other children in order to gain sexual gratification from his severely damaged psyche, in much the same way as the child killer Pedro Lopez felt driven to do so. Again, I just want to say though, I think it's like, it's not just about his experience. It's also, there's genes and there's nurture and nature. That's the right phrase, right? Nature and nurture, like the genes and also the environment that are shaken together to make this monster. It's not purely one or the other. Because but plenty of people have horrible childhoods where they're abused and don't grow up to be abusers. It's the majority, right? But yeah. So it's a bit of both. Past abuse is not an uncommon feature in the life histories of child predators. Yeah, I'd say it's a very strong indicator. There's been very few casual criminalists where it's like, oh yeah, no, this guy's a child predator and he just had a completely normal upbringing. It's unusual. These psychological maladies and sexual paraphilias soon received reinforcement. In 1882, when Fish was 12 years old and had just commenced puberty and incipient sexual awakening, he began his first sexual relationship with a telegraph boy a few years his senior. The telegraph boy indulged Fish's penchant for sadomasochism, and the two swapped between the roles of torturer and tortured, with the younger Fish more frequently taking on the submissive role. The telegraph boy also introduced Fish to the practices of drinking urine and eating feces. Oh my god, which have two, scientific names that David spelled out there, but I don't need to try and pronounce them. Throughout his teenage years, Albert Fish regularly frequented the public baths on the weekend. There he would observe the other boys undressing while he furtively masturbated and waited until he got home with the memory fresh in his mind in order to achieve sexual climax in his bedroom. In 1887, when Fish was 17, he kidnapped a 12-year-old African-American boy, R-worded him, whipped him, and then forced him to drink his own urine and eat his own feces. Fish also partook in the boy's bodily waste. He let the boy go and was never caught. Fish later claimed the boy enjoyed it, but needless to say, this claim is extremely doubtful. What the man? What is... You are a... This... I know, starting this one out, that Albert Fish is he's one of these most up individuals. I knew this was going to be a Pedro Lopez-like episode. But it's what is wrong with you? What the is going on in your brain? You just need to be... if you can go back in time, right? You always said that. Could you go back in time and kill Hitler? You'd be like, yeah, I'd kill Albert Fish as a kid. Just pop him off. Sick. It's so bad. Look at him. He's a horrible dude. We need the death penalty for him. Fortunately, they have the death penalty in America, and I don't remember how this ends, but I'm hoping it's with him strapped to a chair. An electric chair, just in case that wasn't clear. Or a gurney for the injection. In 1890, when Fish was 20 years old, he left Washington, D.C. and traveled to New York City. In order to have sexual contact with men on a regular basis, Fish began working as a male prostitute. That way he was able to frequent areas of New York that were well known to be populated by same-sex attracted men, like the legendary gay bar and brothel Paresis Hall in Manhattan, named after the late-stage insanity caused by syphilis. Wait, what's paresis? I don't get it. What's paresis mean? Eventually, by moving into the circles of New York's illegal sexual underbelly, Fish was able to acquire regular male lovers outside of prostitution, and he tended to favor lovers that were teenagers. These relations almost always became sadomasochistic. Yet, sex with adult men, and even teenage boys, did not satiate Fish's desires, and soon after arrival in New York City, he began R-wording and torturing children. Usually his targets were boys under the age of 6 years old, but sometimes he would go for boys as old as 12. Dude. Occasionally, he would target prepubescent girls. Fish particularly reveled in spanking or whipping his victims to the point that he drew blood. He also indulged in consuming their bodily waste and forcing them to do the same. He played a game where he would force children to defecate onto the floor and then rub their noses in it as if they were dogs. Sometimes Fish would sodomize these children, and other times he'd force fellatio on them. Sometimes he'd do both. Occasionally, Fish found children who were willing to perform sexual acts for a small bribe. Other times, Fish was entirely coercive, often bludgeoning them on the back of the head and tying them up, and even holding children in captivity for days at a time. How is he not getting caught? How often is he doing this? Where's the fucking police? Fish also claimed that he paid other children to willingly procure their friends for him. Additionally, Fish preferred, if possible, to target mentally disabled children since they'd be less likely to report what had happened to them, and African American children since Fish believed that they would be a low priority for the police. Nevertheless, Fish did not shy away from molesting white children either. It was also around 1894, if Fish's own account is to be believed, that he developed an interest in cannibalism and a taste for human flesh. I understand, but he obviously is doing this very prolifically. Where are the police? Thus, in New York City, in his early 20s, Albert Fish was already an active and extremely prolific P-word, if not already a child murderer and cannibal. It's not known how many children Fish attacked and tortured between 1890 and 1898. It's also not known if he murdered any children during this time. Fish later described his activities at length, and in a large number of sickening variations, but he rarely supplied dates. However, Fish later would boast that his victim count was approximately 100 children. This statement almost certainly refers to mostly sexual attacks rather than murders, and it's likely that a good proportion of those attacks, perhaps a few dozen, occurred in the 8 years between 1890 and 1898. On another occasion, Albert Fish boasted that he had victimized children in every US state east of Montana. Indeed, he often traveled across state lines for work, but it's unlikely that Fish traveled quite that widely. It's most likely a figure of speech referring to the approximate number of victims, or else a boast made by an extremely adult mind meant to shock and horrify the listener for Fish's own sexual gratification. However, given that Fish's crimes spanned over 40 years from the 1890s to the 1930s, a total victim count of over 100 children is entirely feasible. A maximum, according to one of Fish's statements, he may have victimized roughly 400 children, of which claimed that he'd murdered 24. Mrs. Fish. Wait, what? This dude had a wife? What the
Anyway, as soon as we got here, she was desperate to get married.
In addition to male prostitution, Albert Fish regularly worked as an unskilled laborer. Polite and deferential, Fish was generally known as a good employee. He earned enough to move his mother, now in her 50s, to New York to live with him. They resided in an apartment on West 101st Street. The extent to which mother and son fed off each other's mental illness is unknown, with Albert's rampant sadomasochism and P-wording and Ellen's auditory and visual hallucinations probably making for an uncomfortable domestic atmosphere. Well, I guess the good news is he's not married. Mrs. Fish is his mum. It's also unclear whether Ellen Fish detected her son's bisexuality and predatory activities, or if she did, to what extent. However, by 1898, when Albert Fish was 28 years old, Ellen said it was long overdue that he should be married. Oh no, never mind. Okay. Perhaps she noticed there was something off about her son. Yeah, what'll solve him? You know what'll turn him into Notch? Getting married! That'll fix everything. She promptly arranged a match between Albert and Anna Mary Hoffman, a local girl of limited means who was then 19 years old. Albert and Anna Fish ultimately had 6 children together: Albert Jr., Anna the Younger, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry between 1899 and 1913. While they were trying for children, according to Fish, he and his wife engaged in sadomasochism every time they had sex. Sometimes Albert would spank or whip Anna, but Anna preferred to spank and whip Albert. He would also regularly consume his wife's urine and feces. Sometimes Fish would urinate on his wife, claiming that she liked it. Once Albert and Anna Fish had their last child in 1913, they stopped having sex altogether. It's unknown whether Anna Fish was aware that her husband was a child R-wordist and torturer, or that he carried on extramarital affairs with gay men. It's also unclear whether Anna Fish truly ever loved her husband, or was rather trying to make the best of a bad lot. Divorces were frowned upon at the time and were fairly difficult to achieve through New York courts. Additionally, over the course of his marriage, Fish would visit brothels in order to be whipped, spanked, and flogged by prostitutes. These visits increased in frequency after 1913 as the sex stopped and his marriage slowly deteriorated. Despite Fish's extreme predatory and sadistic attitude toward children in general, it's likely he never R-worded or tortured his own children. In later years, Fish's daughter Gertrude once said of him, quote, "Pop never lifted a hand to any of us. He even scolded my sister Anna when she punished the youngsters. He was always so kind to us, while my mother was always looking out for herself. It was Pop who held the family together." However, as we shall see, Fish did not completely exclude his own children from his sexual fetishes. It's like, you're like, oh, this story's pretty bad. Oh, that's worse. Oh, that's worse. Oh, and we're on page 10 of 35. I hope the last 10 pages are him just being interrogated and tortured and then strapped to a chair. But probably not. Once he was married, Albert Fish started working at a grocery store, eventually rising to manager, and he desisted from working as a male prostitute. However, Fish continued to date gay lovers and likewise continued attacking children. Meanwhile, Fish's affairs with men continued to expand his horizons. One of Fish's lovers took him to a wax museum, where Fish became sexually excited by the display of a bisected penis in one of the exhibits. This began Fish's obsession with castration. Not long after, Fish tied up a mentally disabled boy and tried to cut off his penis and testicles. However, the boy managed to break free and fled. He was, of course, not able to communicate exactly what had happened, nor point the police towards Fish. Because he was mentally disabled. Bro.
It's a horror show, right?
Albert Fish also began the practice of writing perverted letters to women via classified ads in the newspapers and via matrimonial agencies which provided matchmaking services. He frequently asked the female recipients of those letters to perform degrading violent acts on him, most frequently spanking him with a paddle. Who gets that letter and is like, yeah, cool. I mean, I get if you're like on a specific app that I'm imagining exists for people with, like, you know, it's 2023. If you're into this, go for it. Like, as long as it's all mutual and consenting and all of this stuff. Like, I know people who are into this stuff. It's like, that's fine. But like, if you're just on like a regular matrimonial thing in like the 19th century and some dude's like, and then I want you to whip me with a paddle, you'd be like, bruh, let's not reply to that, dude. Unless you're into it yourself, which I guess then you would, but okay. Occasionally, Fish would lure the women into correspondence by appearing respectable in the first letter or two before becoming increasingly twisted and sexual in his overtones. According to Fish, these women almost never responded to his letters once his intentions became clear. Yeah. Oh my god, what a surprise! Fish also develops the practice of hurling shockingly filthy notes over the walls and fences of girls-only schools to be found and read by impressionable young students. In addition to his sexually predatory behavior, Albert Fish prided himself as a thief and an inveterate liar, skills he claimed to have acquired while living at the orphanage. Quote, "It was like living two lives, one they knew about or one they didn't." As such, Fish regularly engaged in petty thefts and usually got away with it. The exceptions to this early in his life were in Washington in 1886, where he was caught cashing a bad check but was released without charge, and in 1903 when Fish was caught stealing several $100s from the grocery store that he was manager at and sentenced to 16 months in Sing Sing prison. His mother, Ellen, died while he was serving this sentence. His wife, Anna, stuck by him, but perhaps not out of sentiment. Divorces in New York State at the time could not be granted simply because a husband was in prison. Well, that's not reason enough for a divorce. How long's he away for? 25 years. Yeah, you gotta stick it out, lady.
Ned, god damn it.
Unless he had received a life sentence. Meanwhile, Fish regularly had sex with the other male inmates at Sing Sing. It's clear from Fish's later statements that Anna Fish was unaware of this. Albert Fish is like, oh no, prison? And I've heard there's all sorts of terrible things that go on in the showers, which I'm definitely not gonna love. 16 months? Make it 16 years, Judge. Jesus Christ. After his release from Sing Sing, Fish took up a job as a house painter and soon had a knack for it. The job became fairly lucrative and Fish gained a favourable reputation among tradesmen. A remodelling boom was going on at the time because of the spread of electricity and indoor plumbing. The boom permitted Fish to take jobs across state lines. This allowed him to R-word children in other locations and then quickly leave town. Yeah, back in the day when the police it's like, oh yeah, you just go to a different state and you're, that's fine. They're not following you across that state. It's like the modern equivalent of like moving to, what's that country? Where, was it John McAfee where he fled to? Belize? Fish sometimes selected states with high African-American populations, again in the belief that such cases would be given a low priority by the police. In 1910, Fish traveled to Wilmington, Delaware to work on a house there. While staying in Wilmington, Fish coerced a mentally disabled 19-year-old named Thomas Kedden into a sadomasochistic relationship. To quote, he had a pretty face and would pass for 16 except for his size. Looked like a girl. He had the prettiest and fattest ass that I'd ever seen on a man, but he was covered from his neck down to his shins with long black hair. You could hardly see his dicky or behind because of the hair. Fish cut Kedden's hair with scissors and made the rest fall off with hair remover. They met in Fish's lodgings for about a week and a half, and Fish alternated between being the dominant and the submissive. To quote him, I spanked him on his nice fat ass, and it looked like a ripe tomato all over. Then it was his turn to be papa. I was his boy, and I'd done a number 2 in my pants. How good it felt when he spanked, but it hurt, and I always wanted more, and to give him more. I'm hoping that all of these quotes are not from some like biography that he wrote later, but rather the police interrogations where he was, I'd say like having his fingernails pulled out and stuff, but he'd probably like it, wouldn't he? The sick fuck. After 10 days, Fish lured Kedden to an abandoned farmhouse outside of town where Fish tied him up and kept him in a locked room while he was at work. Fish tortured Kedden over the course of 2 weeks. In one document, Fish claims it was 5 weeks. Quote, "I wanted to lash, cut, and burn a nice, big, fat, pretty ass like Thomas had, torture him, hear him scream in pain. It was sweet music to hear him scream, and no one else could. Fish lashed him with a switch, which had thorns in it, paddled him once the switch had made cuts, resulting in a spray of blood over Fish in the room, and stabbed Kedden with needles in his buttocks, penis, scrotum, and belly. At one point, Fish cut Kedden between the buttocks and sucked out his blood. Fish burned Kedden with can. This is enough. This is enough." Inspired by the memory of the bisected penis in the wax museum. Okay, so look, he does terrible things to him. Oh, okay, so I've read it. You don't need to hear it. It's way too much. It's way too much. Then there's a quote from Fish. "I took the first train I could get back home. Never heard what became of him. Never tried to find out. He didn't kill him, though. He just mutilated him and then left." In January 1917, Albert and Anna Fish were living with their 6 children and a small dog at 1013 Fifth Avenue, College Point. The not-happy couple had been married for 19 years. Albert was nearly 47, Anna was 38. Albert pulled in a decent amount of money from his job as a highly competent house painter, paid the rent on time, and also kept accounts for the family. He noticed that lately, they were always spending far more on food than they ever ate. Anna told him that the dog was being given quite a bit of meat and scraps. Albert thought this was strange since the dog was quite small and skinny. He made a point of observing the dog to see how much extra food it was being given by the family in a day. That evening, Albert followed the dog upstairs to the door leading to the attic and watched it sniff and whine at the crack underneath. Albert opened the door and went into the attic to see what the dog was pining over. There in the dark, he stumbled over the body of John Straub, a local handyman who was asleep on a rug on the floor, covered in some of the Fish's family's finest quilts and linens. Straub mumbled sleepily, "What have you got for me this time?" What? There's a dude living in his attic and I assume his wife is feeding him? This is a twist.
You're from that weird family, aren't you?
The puzzle pieces quickly clicked into place. Anna Fish was having an affair with a man that she'd kept stowed in the attic. Albert Fish attests that instead of feeling a murderous rage, in true masochist fashion, he immediately felt aroused at the idea of being so blatantly cuckolded. Quote, "My main thought was that this might be excitement, something new. It was pretty funny leading Straub downstairs and walking into the dining room and telling him to pull up a chair. He was struck dumb. So was my wife. If I had any definite idea in mind when I fetched Anna's lover down from the attic and made him sit at the table across from me with Anna between, it certainly wasn't violence." While Albert Fish was definitely into getting cucked by Anna and John Straub, they certainly weren't feeling the same vibes. Straub spent an awkward few days in the Fish's attic before he disappeared. A few days later, Albert Fish went out on a painting and remodeling job in White Plains, New York, leaving his forwarding address with one of his daughters. On January the 19th, 1917, she telegrammed Fish the following message: "Papa, Mama is gone. Come home." Fish immediately knew this meant his wife had run off with John Straub. When he arrived home, a neighbor told him, quote, "She's gone, Mr. Fish, and everything you ever had has gone with her." Sure enough, when Fish entered the home, all the furniture was gone. Every single room was bare. Upstairs, even the beds and blankets had been taken. Anna had removed the oven, which made the house incredibly cold in the January weather. Albert and Anna's 6 children were huddled together in the empty dining room, and the younger ones were all crying. At the time, Albert Jr. was 18, Anna the younger, 16, Gertrude 13, Eugene 10, John 7, and Henry was only 4. The kids said that Anna Fish had given them money to go to the movies. Fish's neighbor explained that as soon as the children had left, a van pulled up containing some removalists and Straub himself, and they started loading everything in the house. Fish later found out that Anna and Straub had pawned the family possessions for next to nothing and used the money to travel to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the adulterous couple shacked up in a boarding house. Meanwhile, Fish was forced to move his family to a furnished apartment, which, due to the number of his children, was marked up for $25 a week for rent, or $580 per week in modern money. They spent 2 weeks there until Fish could afford to buy basic furniture and move the kids into a less expensive and unfurnished place. According to Albert Fish, the event caused a sharp decline in his already dismal mental health. He started having auditory and visual hallucinations like his mother used to. Fish was once found by his children sitting on the floor, having wrapped himself in a carpet, claiming that the ghost of John the Apostle was talking to him. Fish would also have visions of Jesus and angels who urged him to torture himself to atone for his sins and to torment and castrate young boys, which of course by this point he'd already been doing for years. It was like, oh no, the demons are telling me to castrate young boys. I do want to do Sick man. What a sick man. Fish would babble pseudo-biblical things to himself like, quote, "Happy is he that taketh the little ones and dasheth their heads against the stones." Fish's masochism went into overdrive. As Fish put it himself, the trouble with pain is that you get tough and always have to invent something that hurts worse. As such, Fish began regularly stabbing himself in the taint with needles. Dude. At first, Fish would just push the needles deep inside him and then pull them out. But as the practice continued, the needles got so embedded into his pelvic region that Fish just left them in there. An X-ray Oh, this is like one of those things that's like, oh my God. It's just like shivers down the spine of uncomfortableness. An X-ray later revealed that the area between Fish's scrotum and rectum contained 29 needles. This caused Fish the sensation of sharp but entirely welcome pain whenever he sat down. Ooh, I don't like thinking about that. Fish also fashioned a paddle through which he had driven several carpentry nails which he'd used to flog his own arse until it was covered with blood. Fish also enticed his youngest children, Eugene, John, and Harry, into beating him with a paddle by playing it off as some kind of game. Fish also encouraged his children's friends to join in whenever they were over. Finally, Fish had a practice of stuffing cotton wool soaked in lighter fluid up his arse and then setting the end of it on fire. This is some extreme shit. A few years later, around 1920, 3 of Fish's children had all come down with the measles, and he found it extremely difficult looking after them while balancing his work commitments and unsavory extracurricular activities. Anna Fish, and it was still technically Fish because they never bothered to get a divorce, caught wind of this and telegrammed their eldest daughter, Anna the younger, quote, "Straub can't get a job, and I'm literally starving up here with my 2 new babies. I've heard about Jean, Gert, and Johnny having the measles, and if your father isn't too mad at me, I would come back simply as a housekeeper and work for my keep. And work hard. Only one thing you must tell him. If he takes me in, I have to bring these 2 babies with me, but not Straub." Oh my God. What? You are mother of the year, aren't you? Anna the younger told Albert Fish about the message, but he simply said that his wife could go to hell. A few years later, Fish spotted John Straub at a residential construction site where Straub was working as a carpenter. Fish's demeanor must have been decidedly less cuckish this time because Straub immediately dropped the shingles that he was carrying and ran away while Fish chased after him. Straub ran into an unfinished 2-story house and hid in the closet under the stairs while Fish ran past. Fish thought that Straub had run upstairs, so he bolted up the staircase, which turned out to be unfinished, and Fish nearly plunged off the end of it onto the floor below. It'd be brilliant if that was the end of Albert Fish. Broke his neck. Oh no, Albert! What a shame! Fucking hell, but it's not, is it? Anna Fish and John Straub stayed together in the 1930s and were living in Astoria with their 3 children, all of them around the age that Fish preferred for his victims. The Grey Man of Staten Island. Back in 1919, Albert Fish was raising a family all by himself, depending increasingly on his daughters, Anna and Gertrude. They would look after the youngest boys while Fish was at work. In that year, he traveled to Washington, D.C. for a house remodeling job in the neighborhood of Georgetown. Fish claims that while he was there, he R-worded and stabbed a mentally disabled boy. Fish never learned the boy's name, and he didn't know if he survived. In 1921, Fish was living with his family at 1444 Park Avenue. There he encountered a 5-year-old boy named Cyril Quinn, who lived in the same apartment building with his father and brother. Cyril Quinn came to Fish's apartment to ask if he could read the comics in the newspaper. Fish said yes, and as Quinn sat there reading, Fish stripped completely naked and remained so the entire time the boy was in the room. Fish made a point of walking back and forth in front of Quinn so the boy would look up at him. Quinn told the other neighborhood boys about this, and to Fish's delight, they all periodically came to his apartment to see the strange old man naked. Okay. Oh my God, that would be a different thing today, wouldn't it? Be like, yeah, let's all go look at the weird old naked man. He kind of gets off as us looking at him as he's weird and old and naked. And today it'd be like, you tell your parents, and they'd be like, get that weird old naked man in prison ASAP. That man needs to be on the list. Over the next 7 years, Fish groomed Cyril Quinn so that he could regularly molest him. At first, Fish convinced Quinn to strip naked as well, then introduced a game where they'd spank each other, and then things degenerated to outright sexual contact. In exchange, Fish gave Quinn candy, ice cream, and small sums of money. All the while, Fish harbored thoughts of extreme violence and sexual sadism against Quinn, which he hoped to one day enact. The problem was that Fish was known to Quinn's father and would be an immediate suspect. In 1922, Fish was caught cashing a bogus check for $67 or $1,190 in modern money. Isn't this the thing you went to prison for like 18 months? It's like, bro, Don't do the same crime again. What are you doing? He paid the money back and was given a suspended sentence for petty larceny. Fish also continued to R-word children during this time, including Cyril Quinn, but we do not have confirmed names and dates for the others. On July the 11th, 1924, Fish took a short ferry ride from Manhattan to Staten Island, then the least populated of New York's boroughs, where he lurked around what essentially amounted to empty country lanes. Fish came upon a small family farm where he saw an 8-year-old girl, Beatrice Kill, playing outside alone. Fish approached her and offered her money to help him find rhubarb in the adjoining field. Kids, don't do this. Don't go with the weird man. Money is like candy. Don't take it. Tell your parents. Beatrice was about to leave with Fish when her mother spotted them, and she chased Fish away. Excellent, thank God. Given the Fish was escalating his MO, Mrs. Gill may well have saved her daughter's life. Yeah, I bet she did. And at the very least, she saved her from some pretty horrible shit. Fish returned to the Gill's farm that night and tried to sleep in their barn, but he was discovered by Beatrice's father, Hans Gill, who angrily told him to leave. Fish lingered on Staten Island for a few more days, sleeping rough and hunting for a victim. At 2 p.m. on July the 14th, 1924, Anna McDowell, wife of a Staten Island policeman, sat on the porch of her house, nursing a month-old baby Annabelle, watching her 8-year-old son Francis play nearby. It was then that Anna McDowell saw Albert Fish walking down the middle of the street, twitching and unclenching his hands and talking to himself. Fish looked up and noticed Mrs. McDonald was staring at him, so he stopped, raised his hat in greeting, and continued along the road until he was out of sight. To McDonald, everything about him seemed to be grey. Mrs. McDonald went inside, and her son Francis and his little brother Albert went off to play a game of catch with the other neighborhood boys. Sometime during their game, Albert Fish approached the boys and called Francis over to speak with him. When the other boys looked up, Francis and Albert Fish were gone. At 4:30 p.m., Francis McDowell's neighbor, Mr. George Stern, noticed the boy walking in the direction of Charlton's Woods in the company of an older man. Stern thought this was odd, but paid no more attention to it. Once they were under the cover of the trees, Albert Fish severely beat Francis McDowell until the boy was compliant. Then Fish stripped off the boy's clothes and R-worded him. We've got to the point where this episode's never going to get monetized. It's going to be like 3 hours long, and I'm not going to get paid for it, which sucks.
See what I mean? It's tragedy plus time.
But do I really need to keep doing this? I feel like we're just in the weeds of like never happening, so whatever. Then he took the knife to the victim, leaving deep cuts along the boy's stomach and cutting chunks of flesh out of the victim's legs. Fish cut off most of the skin and muscle on the back of the boy's left thigh so that one of the hamstrings was completely exposed. Fish also intended to castrate the boy and take the genitals home with him. However, Fish thought he had someone coming, so he quickly strangled the boy with his own suspenders and fled the area. When Francis McDowell failed to come home for dinner, the family got worried. His little brother Albert said that Francis had walked off with some old man. Anna McDowell immediately wondered if this was the grey man that she'd seen wandering down the street earlier that afternoon. The father of the family, Arthur McDowell, a policeman, searched the neighborhood and finding nothing, alerted the station. The next day, a search party was established, including cops, neighbors, and local Boy Scouts. It was 3 scouts who found Francis McDonald's corpse lying in Charlton's Woods. The murder set off a flurry of police activity involving over 250 officers and a media firestorm. Arthur McDonald told reporters on July the 16th to quote, "If I catch the killer, I will not harm a hair on his head. I want to see him punished as he deserves. But the law must take its course." Well, yeah, if he murdered a kid, he's going to go through the justice system and then he's going to be killed anyway, because it's 1916 or something like that, 1920, something like that. That he's gonna get the chair, isn't he? Which will be awesome. Despite Anna McDowell flagging up the grey man as a possible suspect and hysteria sweeping across Staten Island toward any old man who seemed to be lurking around and up to no good, the injuries sustained by Francis McDowell during his beating were so severe that the police doubted an older man would have had the strength to do it. In fact, the police suspected 2 men had been involved in the murder. 2 orderlies at a nearby hospital, Clyde Patterson and Jacob Gottlieb, were arrested as suspects but were quickly released. Police also picked up Jacob Herman, an escapee from an insane asylum who claimed that he murdered Francis McDowell, but soon police determined that Herman had been nowhere near the neighborhood on the date of the murder. All told, 12 men were arrested for the murder of Francis McDowell, but were later ruled out and released. As weeks passed, the fact that the killer had not yet been caught further fueled hysteria on Staten Island. One afternoon in August, a teenager discovered a homeless man, John Oskowski, camping out in an abandoned shack 10 miles from the murder site. The teen alerted the owner of a nearby gas station, Salvador Pace, who barged out there with a gun and tried to enact a citizen's arrest. But Oskowski also had a gun and a firefight erupted between the 2 men, but neither were hit. Salvador Pace retreated to the gas station and called the police. Maybe you should have done that already, Salvatore. Like, what should I do? Citizen's arrest? Or, I don't know, call the police to do a real arrest. Stop hunting for glory, Salvador, and just call the cops. You could have both been killed, and neither of you are criminals. When the cops arrived, Iskowski fired on them. The officers managed to hit Iskowski in the side, taking him down. Seeing the cops approaching, Iskowski took his own gun and shot himself in the head. It turned out that Iskowski was a mentally unwell farmer who had run out after arguing with his wife. At the time of McDonald's murder, Iskowski had been living in Radnor, Pennsylvania. Well, that's sad. After that incident, the murder of Francis McDowell faded from the newspapers, and gradually, as police leads dwindled, the case went cold. This was 4 years prior to the abduction of Grace Budd. He's getting away with this for so long. Such rampant crimes. All sort of, a lot of them happening in the same area. It's just wild that he didn't get caught sooner. The Brooklyn Bogeyman. On October the 3rd, 1926, 5-year-old Emma Richardson was found raped and strangled in a Brooklyn alleyway. Police later suspected Albert Fish, but he never confessed to the crime. This does not, however, mean he didn't do it. Albert Fish was sometimes reluctant to confess to murders that he almost certainly committed. Even some of the murders that Fish eventually confessed to committing, he denied until the very end. Fish was also suspected to have raped and strangled 12-year-old Yetta Abramovitz on the rooftop of an apartment building in the Bronx in 1927. She was seen headed toward the roof with an old man, and a body was found having been mutilated with a knife in a way similar to Frances McDonald's. Fish was also suspected of the rape and murder of Barbara Wall, Sadie Burris, Florence McDowell, and Helen Sterler, all in Brooklyn. The murder details were similar, and the girls were between the ages of 5 and 7. Fish never admitted to any of these crimes. In the case of Helen Sterler, the police arrested Lloyd Price, an African-American man who confessed to the crime. He later recounted this confession, claiming it had been beaten out of him by the NYPD. Nevertheless, Price was tried, convicted, and given the electric chair. That's fucked up. He's beaten up. He confesses to a crime because he's being beaten. As soon as he's not being beaten, he's like, no, I didn't do it. You were beating me. And they're like, well, too late. You said you did. Fry for it. And I'm going to go ahead and say that's probably got a little something to do with racism. On February the 11th, 1927, on the second floor of an apartment building at number 99 15th Street in Brooklyn, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney and 3-year-old Billy Beaton were playing in the hallway. They were joined by 12-year-old Johnny McNiff, who lived upstairs and was looking after his baby sister, whom had just gotten off to sleep. McNiff observed the boys playing for a bit and spoke to them. Then McNiff heard his sister wake up and begin to cry. McNiff headed upstairs to comfort the baby and send her back off to sleep. No more than 3 minutes later, McNiff returned to the second floor to see that the two boys were gone. McNiff was then joined in the hallway by Billy Beaton's father, who grew alarmed that his 3-year-old son was no longer playing in the hallway just outside his flat. Thinking the two boys might be in Billy Gaffney's apartment, they headed down the hallway to check. The two boys weren't there. Beaton and McNiff then headed onto the street to see if the boys had gone outside, shouting their names all the while. The boys were nowhere to be seen. Beaton and McNiff then set about searching every floor of the apartment building. They found 3-year-old Billy Beaton unharmed at the top floor of the apartment building. The toddler exclaimed that he and 4-year-old Billy Gaffney had been up on the roof looking at chimneys and steamships. McNiff and Beaton's father noticed that above the ladder at the end of the hallway, the hatch to the roof had been opened, a physical impossibility for either child. Mr. Beaton asked his son whether his friend Billy Gaffney was still up on the roof. The boy shook his head, replying, "The bogeyman took him." 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was nowhere to be found. His parents, Edmund and Elizabeth Gaffney, reported his disappearance to the police that evening. Preliminary attempts were made to find the boy over the course of the night. The next morning, a team of 25 detectives and officers turned up. The police quickly ruled out the act of kidnapping for ransom because the Gaffneys were poor. However, Elizabeth Gaffney had feuded with 2 of her cousins over an inheritance several years ago. These 2 cousins were brought in, questioned, and turned loose within the hour as it became clear they'd got nothing to do with the boy's disappearance. Mr. Beaton was also briefly treated as a suspect because a neighbor, Gabriel Cordovez, alleged that he saw Beaton hurrying from the apartment building on the night of the 11th with a small bundle in his arms. It turned out Cordovez had just got his dates wrong, and the bundle had merely carried laundry. On February the 12th, a truck driver, Eddie Wisniewski, claimed the night before that he'd found a young boy crying on a street corner and turned him over to a police officer. It turned out, though, to be a different boy. On February the 13th, the traffic cop, Officer Martin, reported that he'd seen a short, swarthy woman dragging a crying boy down the street. However, I was like dragging not dragging, but my kid, I was taking her back from school I pick her up early from school on Wednesdays. And I'm like, she's just like not having it. I feel, what was the problem? Is like she wanted something and I didn't give it to her. It was something stupid. And so she's just having an absolute freak out. We're in the middle of the city. It's like busy streets. And she's just on the ground, just screaming. And I'm like, oh God. The only thing that is like makes the scene like, I'm like, oh my goodness, is someone going to go up to me? Is that your kid? And I kind of hope that in that situation, like an officer would come up and be like, everything all right there? But like, the only thing that made it better, she's like, Dad, I want this. Dad, I want this. And I'm like, okay, at least there's that. Because yeah, like that's, I don't know. Kids scream. Yeah, oh my God. The other day we were on the tram and the tram has grey seats and it has red seats. And there's a red seat and a grey seat. And we sit on the grey seat. It's like,
Dad, I want the red seat.
and then just starts screaming her head off. And I'm always like, if I say no, it means no. So like, I'm like, well, we're sitting on the grey seat because the tram's now moving and we can't go over to the red seat. And she's having a freak out. She's like, Dad, the tram's now stopped. I want to go on the red seat. I'm like, no, grey seat. And so 10-minute tram ride, just absolute screaming. I'm like, please be quiet. This is embarrassing. And there are lots of people on here. They're just trying to peacefully ride the tram and you're screaming. Why? Oh, and from that lovely peek into my personal life and amusement, let's get back to children being murdered.
I needed a break.
Billy Gaffney's disappearance was reported in the newspapers, and sure enough, the letters from the malevolent and the mentally ill started coming in. On February the 16th, the Gaffneys received a letter that said, "Wait, do not appear too anxious. Your son is in safe hands. We fought for him, but I got him now. We will get the beaten boy next for Billy to play with, for Billy is lonesome. Do not show this letter to anyone if you know what is good for you. Again, I say that Billy is safe, and we're experimenting on him." Another letter read, "I didn't mean to kill him. God forgive me," and included a map leading to a spot by the Bronx River where the police found nothing. Another letter claimed that Billy Gaffney had been murdered and shoved in a cardboard box in an abandoned apartment building, but when police arrived, the box contained nothing but rags. In March, the Gaffneys received a rambling 3-page letter saying that Billy was being kept imprisoned by a man in a house in South Brooklyn. When the police arrived at the address, they found that the house was empty. All of these people, I hope there's prison sentences for stuff like that. Like, I know wasting police time, that's a crime, right? But these are like so f***ed up wasting police time that this should be, if you get caught, I want to see you serve some time for this kind of shit. This is really horrible. At the end of February, a construction worker digging a new sewer line for a mental asylum in Brooklyn uncovered the remains of a small boy wrapped in a quilt. Police initially thought this was Gaffney, but it turned out that the boy had died of illness and been buried by his impoverished parents on the grounds of the asylum several months prior, well before Gaffney's disappearance. And so, the bogeyman remained at large. Such was the public anger at Billy Gaffney's abduction that in early March, 63-year-old salesman Giles Steele was walking down 92nd Street and politely asked a 4-year-old boy to move out of his way. The boy's mother, Sadie Bernstein, thought Steele was trying to abduct him and whipped up a mob who beat the living out of Steele. He was then arrested, charged with attempting kidnapping, and held on $10,000 bail, $170,000 in modern money. Soon after, the charges were dropped. Believe it or not, Giles Steele ultimately may have considered himself lucky. This is because in the same week in Brooklyn, on 2 separate occasions, 2 convicted sex offenders, Louis Sandman and Samuel Bimberg, were beaten to death by angry mobs. On March the 8th, in Palmer, Massachusetts, a high school student found the month-old remains of a 4-year-old boy in a wine cask at the town dump. The boy's face had been badly mutilated and his jaw crushed. Again, police suspected that this was Billy. Oh, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. I was like, wait, 4 months old remains? But no, they were 4 months old remains. So that makes more sense, because I'd be like, well, that's a baby, not a kid. The boy's father, Edmund Gaffney, was asked to travel up to Massachusetts to identify the body. Luckily, this traumatizing experience didn't have to take place. Shortly before Edmund Gaffney arrived in Massachusetts, police identified the boy as the son of a woman named Ida Kelly. The boy had been beaten by Kelly's employer, Albert Doe, and died 2 days later. Doe had secretly buried the body in the wine cask. I want to know what happens to Albert Doe, and I hope he gets the chair. What the f***? What is going on? Why are there so many dead kids? In St. Louis, Missouri, a 4-year-old boy was picked up by locals and turned into the police in the belief that he was Billy Gaffney. In reality, the boy's grandmother was blind with panic and extremely pissed off that people had simply grabbed her grandson off the street. In Deadwood, South Dakota, a pharmacist's wife claimed that Billy Gaffney was living on a ranch in Montana. Police dutifully chased this one up, and it turns out that the woman was a mentally unstable fantasist. In April, police contacted by a trolley conductor, Anthony Barone, who claimed that at 7 p.m. on February the 11th, 2 blocks from Gaffney's apartment, his trolley had been boarded by a scrawny-looking old man with a white mustache and a small boy who wore neither a coat nor hat against the winter cold, and who matched Billy Gaffney's description. This sounds like a decent lead. The boy cried the entire time they were on the trolley and ignored the old man's attempts to calm him down and keep him quiet. The old man and the boy stayed on the trolley till the end of Hamilton Avenue. Then the man got up and asked Barone where he could catch a ferry to Staten Island. Barone gave him directions. But when the old man and the boy alighted from the trolley, they headed off in the opposite direction. Barone watched the old man drag the boy down the street until they were out of sight. Brown's testimony was affirmed by Joseph Meehan, the trolley engineer, who added the detail that at one point, the old man wrapped his coat around the boy, either to keep him warm or to conceal him. What do you do in a situation like that? I feel like you should do something. But then what if it's just like, oh yeah, it's my grandson. They say it's the grandson. And then what do? You're a trolley conductor. You're not a detective. What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do in a situation like that? If you see something suspicious, what are you supposed to do? I don't know what to do. Someone in the comments tell me what to do in a situation like that. Indeed, that night, the two trolleymen had seen Albert Fish and 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. After departing from the trolley, Fish took Gaffney to an abandoned house next to a small garbage dump somewhere in Astoria. Once in the house, Fish gagged Gaffney with a dirty rag that he had grabbed from a trash pile. Then Fish stripped off the boy's clothes and burned them and threw Gaffney's shoes in the dump. Fish tied the boy up and departed the abandoned house at 2 a.m. and headed home. In 1927, all of Fish's children had either moved out or were old enough to look after themselves. Meanwhile, the 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was left in the abandoned house overnight, gagged, naked, immobilized, terrified. Fish returned to the abandoned house the next day at 2 p.m. On February the 12th, a full 12 hours later, as the search for Gaffney was just getting started, Fish brought with him his quote-unquote implements of hell: a butcher's knife, a cleaver, a small handsaw. Fish also brought a cat o' nine tails, which he had crudely fashioned from an old leather belt. A cat o' nine tails, it's like a whip with like 9 whipping parts. I remember learning this from like some visit to some old boat in the UK. Like we went on a tour and they were like, how do they keep the sailors in line? They use the cat o' nine tails for whipping them. Holy shit. I don't want to read this. Fish whipped Gaffney until his buttocks bled, and then he does horrible things to him. He does horrible, horrible things to him, which involve removing parts of his body. And I'm reading this and you don't need, this is not Saw. This is CSI. We don't need to read that. He died. Fish stabbed the victim in the belly and drank his blood, and then he dismembered the body. The bogeyman took the victim's, without reading. So he takes the victim's body parts and then he throws them in the East River. Fish retained some of the body parts, sorry. I'm trying to just read this without giving you all of the details because you don't need these details. Trust me, you don't want these details. And if you want these details, this isn't the true crime show for you, to be honest. Some people write in the comments like, Simon, I wish you'd read these bits. And I'm like, this isn't this type of show. I'm not into this stuff. I don't care whether you're into this stuff, to be honest. I want this show to be, as I've said many times, it's CSI, it's not Saw. It's about there's a monster and let's get to him getting his due. Let's not talk about the horrible depravities of his crimes. When Fish described the act of cannibalism to a psychologist, Dr. Frederick Wertham, the doctor described him as, quote, like a housewife describing her favorite methods of cooking, but at times his voice and facial expression indicated a kind of satisfaction and ecstatic thrill. I said to myself, however you define the medical and legal borders of sanity, this certainly is beyond that border. It took Fish 4 days to fully consume Billy Gaffney's remains. He even managed to eat the victim's penis, which he described as, quote, sweet as a nut. But he found that the testicles were inedible and flushed them down the toilet. He claims that his children saw him cooking and eating the meat, but they didn't recognize it as human. The rest of Billy Gaffney's remains were never recovered from the banks of the East River, nor has the house in Astoria where he was murdered ever been identified. It's neither here nor there, but the listener might want to know that while later extracting this confession from Fish, one Sergeant Fitzgerald of the NYPD became so enraged that he kicked Fish square in the balls and threatened to beat him with a rubber hose. That's a nice detail, I like that. The problem is I know he would enjoy it because he's sick. That sucks. The Darling Buds of May. By 1927, most of Fish's kids had moved out and he was only responsible for his youngest sons, John and Henry, aged 17 and 14 respectively. They moved into a house on 56th Street in Brooklyn, with the upstairs rooms rented out by one Mrs. Helen Carlson, a widow with 2 young sons. Fish took an interest in Carlson's youngest boy, who was 7 years old. Fish constantly gave the boy candy and frequently asked Carlson for permission to take the boy to the movie. She refused. Good move! Not because she distrusted the old man, but because she was still shaken by the highly publicized disappearance of Billy Gaffney. Excellent. Nice to see a little bit of stranger danger coming into this. Yes. After about a month, Carlson awoke one morning to find a letter shoved under her bedroom door. It was written by Fish. It proposed to Helen Carlson that they engage in some sadomasochistic sex, written in quite obscene language. Carlson burned the letter and was too embarrassed to bring it up with her tenant. Then Fish wrote her 2 more obscene letters. Helen Carlson confronted Fish and told him to get out of her house. Fish grew angry and abusive, and he moved out with his boys a few days later.
Stop writing me these up letters. What are you talking about? Why do I...
He got angry? What the fuck? When Carson went upstairs to clean Fish's room, she found a nail-studded paddle with dried blood on it, and in addition, Fish had taken a shit on the bedroom floor. In 1928, Fish approached 5-year-old Mary Little on the sidewalk next to a New York candy shop. He came up to the girl, grabbed her hand, and asked if she was alone. She said no and pointed to her mother standing not far away. Fish released Mary Little, and she ran over to her mother. Fish then stood there for a long time, staring at them before throwing his head back and laughing. Mrs. Little said, quote, "It was such a horrible cackling sound." And then Fish quickly walked away. On May the 27th, 1928, Albert Fish read the classified ad from Edward Budd seeking employment in the country. Oh my God, I just remembered something. There's a news story going around that is a real news, that there's a dude who goes to parks, like children's play parks in Prague, and just stands there with a dummy in his mouth, a pacifier, Americans. And my wife was like, we got to watch out for this dude. And I'm like, yeah, we do. But I also don't, it's like one of those things where it's like the fact that he's got this dummy in his mouth and he's sucking on this dummy and then he'll apparently offer it to children. And I'm like, the fact that he's doing that somehow makes him less scary. The dude's a fucking weirdo. No question about it. Needs to be put on a list where he can't go to children's parks. But the fact that he's just standing there with a dummy makes me think this dude is mentally ill. He's not a predator. Or maybe he's both. Look, either way, if I saw that dude, I'd ring the police because they're hunting for him. But the fact that he's got the dummy, and I was talking to my wife about this, it makes him less scary because there's something wrong with him. Okay, so now we've got the classified ad from right at the beginning of the episode. Albert Fish visited the Budd residence and spun the family a pack of lies about his owning a farm on Long Island. Fish arranged to pick up Edward Budd and his friend Willie Corman and drive the two out to a property near Farmingdale on June the 2nd. The next day, May 29th, Albert Fish went out and purchased brand new versions of his implements of hell, knife, cleaver, handsaw, and placed them under his mattress back at his apartment. At the time, Albert Fish was living in an apartment at 409 East 100th Street, having moved several times since living at 1444 Park Avenue, where he had begun grooming 5-year-old Cyril Quinn back in 1921. When Fish lived in the same building as Quinn's family, he could not risk murdering the boy since he would immediately become a suspect. But that hadn't been a problem for a long time now. Fish continued his acquaintance with the now 12-year-old Quinn, periodically engaging in sexual acts with him in exchange for money, sweets, and other presents. Quinn had also introduced Fish to his friend Tony, who was the teenage son of an Italian coal, wood, and ice supplier. According to Fish, on several occasions, all three of them engaged in spanking and sexual intercourse. Fish was chuffed to find out that Tony had spoken to Cyril Quinn about, quote, "the big monkey I had." On May the 29th, the same afternoon that Fish purchased his new implements of hell, he arranged to meet with Cyril and Tony, who were out on the street playing a game of box pool. Fish asked the boys if they'd eaten lunch. They said no, and so Fish invited them round to his apartment for a bit of food. However, the offer was not as benign as it seemed. To quote Fish, "I intended to kill both of them, cut off their penises, split them open, broil them on the gas, and eat them as well as their big fat asses and the meat off their bellies and legs." When Fish and Cyril and Tony entered the apartment at 100th Street, they all stripped off their clothes, as was the custom that Fish had imposed on the boys a long time ago. As Fish prepared cheese sandwiches in the kitchen, Cyril and Tony began wrestling in Fish's bedroom, falling onto the bed. As their wrestling continued, the two boys fell laughing to the floor. The mattress had been slightly dislodged during their bout. While on the floor, Cyril and Tony saw something that should have been hidden underneath the mattress. Cyril lifted up the corner and saw a butcher's knife, a cleaver, and a handsaw. While not fully divining their meaning, the boys knew enough about Fish's mental instability and penchant for sadomasochism to become scared. Excellent, get the out of there. I really hope this is one of the stories that we know about because they go to the police and talk about it rather than Fish later talking about it when he's getting interrogated, because he seems to just have admitted to everything. The two boys scooped up their clothes and ran out of the apartment, saving their own lives in the process. Excellent. Fish never saw either of them again. On June the 2nd, Albert Fish telegrammed the Budd family from a New York office, saying that he was delayed on business in New Jersey and would come by the next day. On the 3rd, Fish arrived at the Budd residence and was given lunch. His attention was captured by 10-year-old Grace Budd, whom Fish considered was a better target than Edward Budd and Willie Corman. Fish made up a lie that he was going to his niece's birthday party that afternoon and proposed that he take young Grace along. After Fish gave the bogus address for the party, Grace's parents, Albert and Delia, consented. On 14th Street, Fish picked up his implements of hell, which he'd wrapped in a package and left for safekeeping with the owner of a local newsstand. Fish and Grace then boarded the train for the small town of Irvington, with Grace helpfully preventing Fish from forgetting that package on the train. Fish took Grace to the abandoned Wysteria cottage at 359 Mountain Road. Grace stayed outside, picking the freshly bloomed spring wildflowers. Fish went inside, stripped off his clothes, and then called out the window for Grace to come inside. Fish hid in the closet until Grace was upstairs. He burst into the room, terrifying Grace, who tried to escape and tell her mother. Fish forcibly stripped her naked, kneeled on her chest, and strangled her. And then he does horrible things to her, and then he eats some of her, and you don't need those details. For the next 6 years, police chased many leads and pursued many suspects, but they could not find the man who introduced himself to the Budd family as Frank Howard, nor were they able to locate Grace's remains, most of which lay for years undiscovered on the lonely grounds of the abandoned Wysteria cottage. No rest for the wicked. From 1928 to 1932, in the 4 years after the murder of Grace Budd, it's highly probable Albert Fish continued to prey upon young children. Every crime Fish committed in the 1920s points towards an escalation of his MO, and it's very unlikely Fish simply stopped on his own account. While that has happened once or twice in criminal history, like with the Golden State Killer, sex-based serial killers generally don't stop until they are stopped. 99% of the time, we witness the exact opposite phenomenon. The murders of sex-based serial killers grow more frequent, brutal, audacious, or sloppier, as the case may be. Fish certainly made no statement to the effect that he had curtailed his activities at the time. He was simply uncooperative and vague about the details of his crimes in certain periods. Therefore, it's almost certain that while the police looked in vain for the abductor of Grace Budd, Fish continued to kidnap, rape, torture, and quite possibly murder and cannibalize other young children. I should also point out, dear listener, that our story does not end in 1932. But why haven't other potential victims from this period been linked to Albert Fish? Well, first of all, it must be said, in New York in the 1920s and 30s, Fish was only one of hundreds of predators who kidnapped and or molested children at the time. Many cases went unsolved or even unreported. When it comes to abducted children who were never found, dozens and dozens of them went missing in New York, but they were not just linked to Fish. While he liked to boast gleefully and rapturously about the atrocities that he had already admitted to, Fish was not always forthcoming about his crimes and could be quite sullen with the police. When it comes to murders, plenty of children's bodies were discovered over the years in various stages of decomposition, but again, without a confession, there may not have been enough evidence to link them to Fish. Well, it's weird that he admits so apparently, audaciously to some, but others he's like, no, I'm not talking about that. And it's like, bro, you're already getting whatever the maximum penalty is. What's the harm in telling us about the others? Maybe providing some closure to some people who need it. Not that, you'd have any motivation for that. You f***ing psycho. Lastly, if Fish preyed upon children when he traveled, as he had already done for decades, these cases would be even more difficult to connect to him. There is one New York City case from May 2nd, 1931, involving a 6-year-old named Robin Jane Liu, which this has been placed on a shortlist of Albert Fish's suspected victims. It's been posted to Wikipedia and, as a result, has been parroted by dozens of other websites on the internet in a myriad of different languages. However, the citation provided for this victim is a false one. Nowhere on the page cited, nor as far as I can see anywhere else in the book, is there a reference to Robin Jane Liu. I personally wonder if someone decided to throw their friend's name on the Albert Fish Wikipedia page as a prank, in which case the prankster can pat themselves on the back, because almost the entire internet seems to have taken it as gospel. Although I must point out that this is rather disrespectful to the memory of Fish's actual victims and to their families. If I'm wrong about Lou, please feel free to provide information in the comments below or reach out to me on Twitter. At any rate, I hope David Baker on Twitter, by the way, although I'm sure there's many David Bakers. I'm sorry, David, I don't have Twitter on my iPad, and I can't remember your exact Twitter handle. I follow David, so if you go to me, I'm at Simon Whistler. I follow 20 people, you'll see David on there. At any rate, I hope you have enjoyed this taste of behind-the-scenes research work and eye for detail, which we pride ourselves on at Casual Criminalist. Yeah, I was just thinking, that's insane, David, that you checked the references on Wikipedia for something that you weren't even going to use, which is, that's great. Thank you.
Toby's a genuine nerd, and he doesn't care if you have a problem with that.
In 1929, Albert Fish's children grew increasingly concerned about his welfare. Although only 59 years old, Fish was aging prematurely. His health was slowly dwindling, and his sanity seemed quite fragile. Generally speaking, Fish's children loved their father. From their perspective, he had always been kind, never really mistreated them, the sick paddling game notwithstanding, and they very much viewed Fish as the victim when his wife left him, took everything they owned, and abandoned the entire family. Well, yes, in that case, he was the victim. Just because you are a victimizer doesn't mean you can't be a victim as well. That's fair. Hey, do we feel sorry for him? No!
Yeah, that guy.
Do we feel sorry for the children? Oh my god, yes. Those poor children just basically being abandoned by their mum, and their dad is Albert Fish. Holy In the eyes of his children, Fish had worked to look after all 6 kids on his own, but he never seemed to recover from his wife's infidelity and seemed to have a screw loose ever since. As such, Fish's children viewed him with a mixture of pity and gratitude for raising them. Meanwhile, Fish's daughters, Anna and Gertrude, now 28 and 25 respectively, had found themselves husbands, moved out, and started families of their own. It's amazing that they turned out sort of normal.
Everything is possible.
They were no longer around to look after him. Fish's sons were also grown up, and the youngest, Henry, now aged 16, was ready to fly the nest. The problem was that nobody thought Albert Fish should live on his own. As such, Fish moved in with his eldest son, Albert Jr., now aged 30, still single and unemployed at the time, trying to get back on his feet. It was Albert Sr. who paid the bills, working as a handyman and painter at a Harlem sanatorium. Father and son lived together in an apartment on 74th Street. One day, in 1929, Albert Sr. went to work, leaving Albert Jr. with some money to buy groceries. Albert Jr. passed the day watching several movies at the cinema and then went to the grocery store and returned home at around 6 p.m. to cook dinner. Be like, dude, you're unemployed and you're just at the movies. Go out and look for a job. What the fuck? When looking under the kitchen sink, Albert Jr. found 2 paddles which had carpentry nails driven through them, and the tips of the nails were stained with dry blood. The thing to bear in mind is, Albert Jr. had already been 18 when his father started the masochistic paddle game with his younger children, Eugene, John, and Harry. Albert Jr. was not included, presumably because he was too old to be fooled into thinking such a game was innocent and not to suspect that his father was using his kids to get his rocks off. Instead, this was the first time Albert Jr. had ever seen the paddles. Oh, so he wasn't even aware. Okay, well that's a relief. I mean, not really, because if he was aware, then maybe you could have done something about it, but you know what I mean. It's a relief that he's not in on this sick shit. When Albert Sr. came home, his son asked them what they were for. Albert Sr. candidly explained that he used them on himself whenever he had strange feelings come over him. The paddles, Albert Sr. said, made him feel better. This was a roundabout and euphemistic way of admitting to being a masochist. Needless to say, this creeped Albert Jr. out, and the younger man, in true 1920s repressed fashion, simply resolved not to talk about it again. Yeah, that is like, okie dokie, interesting. Okay, what's for dinner?
Don't eat the pie!
Meanwhile, in the spring of 1929, Albert Fish had begun a prolific and obscene letter-writing campaign to women who had posted classified ads in the newspaper looking for work. In the letters, he posed as Robert Fisk, a wealthy Hollywood producer who was visiting the East Coast and who had a mentally disabled teenage son named Bobby. Fish offered the women money for a variety of services. Quote, "I wish you could see me now. I'm sitting in a chair naked. I can taste your sweet piss, your sweet shit. You must pee in a glass, and I shall drink every drop of it as you watch me. Tell me you want to do number 2. I will hold my mouth to your sweet honey fat arse and eat your sweet peanut butter as it comes out fresh and hot. That is how they do it in Hollywood." What the did I just read? As for Bobby, to quote, "The doctor says 3 or 4 good spankings a day on his bare behind will do him good, as he is nice and fat in that spot. It will be an aid to him. When he don't mind you, then you must strip him and use the cat o' nine tails. Tell me you'll do that." These letters carried on for quite some time, no doubt distressing many recipients. In one case, I think people, maybe regular people are just like less used to this. The that I get, like the DMs is where demons lay. People are up to some crazy weird shit. And there's a lot of people that are just like clearly mentally deranged. And at first, I guess I was a bit like, not alarmed, but like, oh my God, what the fuck? And now I'm just like, yep. Standard day in the email inbox, isn't it, chaps? But yeah, I can see why I was like, what are you talking about? This isn't so bad. It's just like, it's crazy people. There are crazy people. And I've just become very desensitized to crazy people, I suppose. In one respect, the letters were a way for Fish to enjoy an erotic thrill by writing out his fantasies and forcing them onto unsuspecting women. But in another respect, as Fish's psychiatrist later asserted, they were in part genuine proposals for sexual activity, with Fish fantasizing that one of the women would take him up on it either out of lust or in exchange for cash. As such, in late September, Fish was stupid enough to include his return address on one of the envelopes in the hopes of gaining precisely that opportunity. That's not a clip. Why? You're so deranged. What the It backfired. Mrs. E. Solarid, a housekeeper, turned the letter over to the police. The cops went to Fish's 74th Street apartment and arrested him. At his trial in December, the court social worker determined that Fish was mentally ill and recommended that he be sent to the psychiatric ward at Bellevue Hospital for observation. During the intake interview, Fish spun a story about the breakdown of his marriage and how he had been sexless for 2 years, saying that the letter writing had, quote, just become a bit of a habit. That doesn't make it less of a crime, does it? Although I guess there's not really a crime here. It's just being a weirdo, and they're trying to get him sent away for being mental. So, Oh gosh. That's a tricky one, isn't it? He's really going to get off for this, isn't he? Fish spends a month locked up at Bellevue. Okay, never mind, but that's not long enough. He needs to be locked up there forever. Actually, no, he doesn't. He needs to be electrocuted. Let's kill him. Kill him! I really hope he ends up getting killed. I'm thirsty for his blood. Oh god, that's weird, considering what we read earlier. That's not what I meant. I'm bloodthirsty. I want him to die. I'm excited about his death. It's a thing to say, but it's f***ing Albert Fish, isn't it? He spent a month there. He's noted as staff as being polite and cooperative, short, thin, and prematurely aged. Fish also gave off the impression that he was perfectly harmless. Meanwhile, Dr. Menace Gregory, head of the psych ward, determined the Fish was not mentally impaired, but may well suffer from a sort of sexual psychopathy. Ultimately, Gregory concluded that Fish was not insane and did not represent an immediate threat to himself or the public. You just diagnosed him with sexual psychopathy, and you're like, he's not a threat. He's not a threat to the public. Did you scan his ass? He's got needles in there. He's been beating himself with a paddle. How is he not a threat to himself? And he's certainly a threat to society. Fish was released and went back to court, where he was convicted of writing obscene letters and given 6 months probation. Okay, so writing obscene letters is a crime. Who knew? Maybe people. It's something I'd never do. I need to know if that's a crime or not, because it's not something I'm going to do. So shocked were Fish's children at the incident that while he was locked up in Bellevue, none of them tried to communicate with him or answered any of his letters. For the time being, Fish was on his own. Shortly after his release from the psych ward, he began writing letters to women via a matrimonial service. Dude, you're not learning your lessons. You went to prison for the check fraud thing, and then he does it again. And then he writes the letters, and he goes to prison. Or he gets probation, and then he just does it again. But this time, he was much more gentlemanly and kept his obscenities to himself. Fish targeted widows who were looking for a new husband, so he made sure to come off as a caring companion. Okay, never mind. Take back what I said, he did learn his lesson. Due to the social conventions of the time, these widows were homemakers with young children and were therefore eager to find another man to provide for them. As such, Fish was able to propose marriage fairly quickly and with good odds of being accepted. Bear in mind that Albert Fish had never bothered to get a divorce from his first wife, Anna, even though he could have easily gotten one on grounds of adultery. As such, Fish was committing bigamy. In order to avoid getting caught, however, Fish used a pseudonym. The past, everybody. It's like, I remember when I got married, it was like you had to take all sorts of documents. There's lots of legal. It's not like, yeah, what's your name? Peter. Done! Easy! Peter, congratulations! The first widow Fish married in early 1930 was a woman from the Bronx with a 10-year-old son. According to Fish, after they were married, he asked his new wife to let him drink her urine and eat her feces while he masturbated. When his new wife rejected this idea.
No, Albert! What the Albert?
Fish got a coffee cup, peed into it, and drank it in front of her. The marriage lasted one whole uncomfortable week, at the end of which Fish just got up, left the apartment, and disappeared without a trace. Only a few weeks later, Fish married Myrta Nicholas, a widow from Columbus, Ohio. She had 7 children from a previous marriage. Fish would, I'm surprised, but it's the past. Fish would play a game with the children, which he called Buck Buck How Many Hands Up, in which Fish pulled down his pants and left his underwear on since Myrta was right there watching, turned his back to the kids, bent over, and guessed how many fingers they were holding up. If he didn't guess the number correctly, the children would gleefully hit his ass with a heavy stick, the same number of times as the fingers they were holding up. One of the children, Mary, who was 12 at the time, recalled that Fish deliberately tried to guess wrong, sometimes guessing a number absurdly higher than the number of fingers in the room. In private, Fish yet again suggested to his new wife that she let him drink her piss and eat her Myrta refused in horror, and Fish disappeared in a few days. The third widow, Estelle Wilcox, was from Waterloo, Iowa, and she had 3 children. A week after they married, Fish started putting advertisements in the newspaper offering housekeeping work to young women, even though Wilcox was taking care of all of the cleaning. This weirded her out, and she suspected Fish wanted to use them for sexual purposes. Then, nearly 2 months into the marriage, Fish admitted that he wanted to eat his wife's shit and provided a demonstration using his own shit. Needless to say, this upset Estelle Wilcox intensely. Can you imagine? It's just like, oh my God, Albert, what are you doing? Or whatever your name is. Like the pseudonym. Again, when it was clear that Fish couldn't convince her to engage in such activities, he disappeared. To quote Estelle Wilcox, "I think he was crazy. I was glad he was gone. I don't care what happens to him," which is a rational response. That is some normal ass behavior there, Estelle. The whole bigamy marathon happened over the course of just 4 months in the first half of 1930. Later that year, Fish was arrested for cashing a bogus check. Come on, what are you doing? For $300, that's over $5,000 in modern money, he was charged with petty larceny and given a suspended sentence. In 1931, Fish got a job as a handyman and dishwasher in the Steeplechase Hotel in Queens in exchange for room. Just a slight comment there. How absurd were checks? Like, a company, an advertiser wanted to pay me with a check the other day. They were like, "Can we send you a check?" And I'm like, what the f*** is a check? Like, I haven't had a check since my grandma wrote me one for my birthday when I was a kid. Like, what is actually going on with checks? I guess maybe they're more common in America. I went to my bank and I was like, can you cash a check? And they're like, no. And I'm like, wait, so at all? And they're like, no, we don't even provide that service for a fee. So I went to another bank and it's like, do you do this? And they're like, yeah, it's very expensive though. And you're going to get destroyed on the exchange. And I'm like, this is insane. I think we ended up just being like, don't pay me. Oh, don't get any ideas, advertisers. You don't get it for free if you try and pay me in a check. I think, did the check arrive? I think I even got the check. Did I get the check or am I imagining that? I don't remember. Look, this isn't an interesting story, but it's like checks were insane. You could just write a check and be like, yeah, okay. It's like, what if it's not good? What if you don't have enough money in the bank? I'll have to ask my advertising guy if we ever got paid for that. What happens? I've completely forgotten. In August, Fish was indulging his practice of throwing obscene letters over the fence of a girl's boarding school for the students to read when one of his notes was picked up by the headmistress. She lay in wait until she saw Fish do it again. The headmistress confronted Fish and then identified him to the police. When the cops showed up at the room at the Steeplechase Hotel, they found the most obscene notes under his mattress, a cat and nine tails made from a belt and a carrot and a sausage, both of which were rotten and had traces of fecal matter on them. When the arresting officer asked a Fish what the carrot and sausage were for, Fish shrugged and nonchalantly replied, I stick them up my arse. At least he's being honest. A court social worker again determined that Fish was mentally ill and he was shipped off to Kings County Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Fish was interviewed only once while he was there, and his psychiatrist, Dr. Loughran, noted that he was quiet, cooperative, and self-oriented. Loughran made no notes about Fish's sexual paraphilias and merely judged him to be sane. Fish was released after 10 days on September the 5th, 1931. Like last time, he was given a 6-month suspended sentence. Does this guy never go to prison? It's always just like, I got probation, he got suspended sentence. He went to jail once for like fraud back in the day for like 18 months. And since then, they're like, oh, well, it's okay. It's not a big deal. He was then released into the custody of his eldest daughter, Mrs. Anna Collins, who lived with her husband and children in Astoria. On February the 15th, 1932, the body of 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor was found in the woods near Far Rockaway in Queens. She had been bludgeoned to death and her body was severely mutilated with a knife post-mortem. Some parts of the flesh had been removed from the scene. The coroner determined that she was not sexually interfered with. On December the 15th, 1932, 17-year-old Benjamin Collins was found dead on his yacht off of Long Island Sound, again with knife mutilations, but this time with signs that the body had been sexually interfered with. Police suspected Albert Fish of both of these murders, but he never confessed to them. Wait, I was confused. It's just, okay, this 17-year-old's got a yacht. Okay. Number of yachts I had at 17, 0. I mean, number of yachts I've got today, still 0. Don't particularly want a yacht. It's a lot of work. I always remember that quote. There are the 2 best days of owning a boat. The day you buy it and the day you sell it. And it always made me think like yacht ownership and boat ownership must be quite a hassle. So it's not something I've particularly been like, yeah, I'd like a boat. Although I do see these boats like going down the river, just like motoring along. And I'm like, that looks pretty peaceful. That looks pretty nice. But then I'm like, that looks like a massive hassle. I've already got enough hassles in my life. Albert Fish has sent you a message. By June 1934, Grace Budd had been missing for 6 years. On June the 4th, the day after the anniversary of her abduction, the Budd family received a newspaper clipping with a photograph of a teenage girl who the sender thought was Grace standing next to the USS Colorado. That's from earlier. The Budd family promptly put out appeal in the media to find the girl in the photo. Albert Fish, now 64 years old, read these appeals at his kitchen table. Of course, he knew the girl in the photo wasn't Grace Budd. Fish had killed her within hours of abducting her, but the old man was intrigued to see the Budd family mailing address among the articles. He liked sending sick notes to women. Perhaps Fish ought to put Delia Budd out of her misery and let her know what had happened to her daughter. This is a bad idea. I'm not sure what gets you caught, but I get the feeling this might lead to it. It feels very much like writing down your crimes and then mailing them to your victim or to your victim's family, which sounds like it's a very bad idea. Albert Fish was now living in a 4-room apartment at 1883 Amsterdam Avenue in Manhattan, only a stone's throw away from Broadway on the Upper West Side. He and Albert Jr. had landed jobs as superintendents of 3 apartment buildings in the area, and as part of the deal, they got to live in one of them. Arthur Jr. spent his days doing maintenance and repairs and responding to tenant complaints, while his creepy old dad silently took out the trash, swept the hallways, and killed rats and other vermin. But mostly, the old man just spent his time in the apartment fantasizing about unspeakably vile things and indulging his sexual fetishes. That is to say, when he wasn't out wandering the streets on the prowl for children or taking train trips out of the city. One day in June, Albert Jr. came home unexpectedly to collect a box of tools when he found his father naked in the middle of the sitting room, masturbating with one hand and flogging his ass with a nail-studded paddle in the other. Be like, I'll come back later. God damn it. Blood was running freely from the puncture wounds on his buttocks. This was the last straw. Albert Jr. had hoped his father's perversions had faded since his second arrest for writing obscene letters 3 years ago, but recently Albert Jr. had figured out that his father was stabbing himself in the crotch with sharp needles. And now the spike paddle was back. It was clear that Albert Sr. was a lifelong degenerate and would die a lecherous old man. His eldest son told Fish to move out as soon as possible. Albert Jr. resolved to have nothing to do with his father ever again. Smart move, Albert Jr. Smart move. After the old man moved out, Fish stayed at a series of cheap boarding houses to keep costs low. He had a standing invitation to stay with either of his daughters, Anna Collins or Gertrude DeMarco, who loved him dearly, but both households were crowded with husbands and children, making it almost certain that Fish's proclivities would be discovered again. In the autumn of 1934, Fish took the train up to Irvington and visited the abandoned Wysteria cottage where he'd killed Grace Budd. Then, a mere block away from the murder site, Fish tried to abduct 6-year-old Marion Laferde, who was playing in her front yard, by offering her candy and peanuts and to show her, quote-unquote, funny pictures. Bruh. PSA for kids. If a man comes up to you and is like, hey, want some candy and to look at some funny pictures, that man is a pedo. There's no doubt about it. However, Marion's father, Alonzo, came outside and told Fish to go away, or he'd call the police. Excellent parenting. Oi, fuck off! Or I'll call the coppers. On September the 30th, 1934, Fish wrote a letter to a woman named Grace Shaw, who had posted a classified ad in the New York World looking for employment. Fish said in the letter that his name was Robert E. Hayden and that he was a big-time Hollywood producer with a 19-year-old son named Bobby. Another callback. He was mentally disabled from falling down the stairs when he was 5. Fish also tossed in the detail that the kid also had caught polio and needed help in the bath. Fish had said that he was heading back to Los Angeles in a couple of weeks and needed someone to look after Bobby in New York. Fish detailed how Bobby should be cared for, and when he inevitably got around to the subject of discipline, he said, quote, I am trying out a European treatment. Professor Cairo of Vienna, Austria, recommends he be whipped. They are having great success over there in cases like it. Should you take him in your charge? On the first occasion that he shows temper, spank him soundly as you would a small boy, and don't hesitate to use the cat o' nine tails on his bare behind when necessary. Bobby is now in Philadelphia under the charge of a colored woman I've known for 25 years. She says whipping is the best medicine she ever used. Despite the obvious subtext of this load of randy hogwash, there was nothing excessively obscene or illegal about this particular letter. As such, Fish felt safe in giving it a return address in the vague hope of receiving a reply. And this time, he did. The very next day, Grace Shaw wrote back saying she'd recently been widowed and was interested in the position. Wow. Like, you gotta be desperate for a job to be like, okay, I'll whip your disabled son. I need money. Yet there was also subtext in Shaw's reply. She said she had no problem with stripping a 19-year-old man naked and spanking him. In fact, she even volunteered to get a teenage daughter involved in spanking Bobby as well. Oh my, you've discovered another weirdo, haven't you, Albert? What are the odds? What are the odds? On October the 4th, Fish escalated things by saying that he, Robert Hayden, also deserved to be punished, and offered to pay Grace Shaw $100 or $2,230 in modern money if she'd come over to his boarding house and whip him instead. That's a lot of money to whip somebody. Grace later admitted she was interested in the offer of a large amount of cash in exchange for a few hours of femdom work. It was the Great Depression after all. Yes, of course. On October the 7th, Fish escalated things even further. He wrote another letter to Grace Shaw from the fictitious Robert Hayden, and then, posing as a mentally ill man named James W. Pell, Fish pretended to be Hayden's messenger and hand-delivered it to Grace Shaw at her house. Shaw read the letter, while Fish, masquerading as James Pell, just stood there staring at her. The letter explained that Pell had been traumatized by the death of his son in World War I and was basically catatonic. He didn't have any relatives to look after him. The letter proposed that Shaw take Pell into her care in exchange for $100 a week. That's like $2,000 a week. That's an enormous amount of money. The fictitious Robert Hayden explained, quote, at times he imagines he is a boy at school. Humor him. Let him be a boy all over again and spank him. Also, he gets short of breath and is subject to fits when in water. For that reason, he must never take a bath alone. Take him upstairs, undress him, give him a bath, and spank him good. And how about my spanking? Do I get it? Oh, how I hope I do. Sincerely yours, Robert E. Hayden. Weird. So weird. This bizarre turn of events amounted to Fish soliciting prostitution without actually soliciting prostitution. Grace Shaw gave up the pretense and explained to Pell/Fish that she couldn't spank him today because her husband was home. She had previously lied about being a widow. Oh, Grace, you're also a weirdo, aren't you? Fish went away disappointed. The next day, Fish wrote Shaw saying that he'd be back when her husband was out, and then he went into lurid details about how exactly he liked to be spanked. However, Grace Shaw had entertained this man for long enough. Fish unexpectedly turning up at her house crossed the line. Shaw ignored Fish's letters for 2 weeks before replying that she wasn't interested in looking after James, Pell, or Bobby anymore. On October the 24th, Fish sent Shaw 2 obscene letters in a single day, at one point remarking, "Take 100 women and give each the same chance I gave you, and 99 of them would have jumped at it." No, they wouldn't. They'd be like, "What are you talking about? It's remarkable that you hit on the one that would actually reply to your sick." Indeed, we could poll the audience, but I somehow doubt 99% of women would jump at the chance to have a kinky S&M session with Albert Fish. At any rate, Fish then rambled on about how Bobby was a chronic masturbator who should be castrated or sterilized, before returning to his favorite subject of spanking and how he liked to paint his ass red or gold for such occasions. What is going on in your head? I know you're mental, but it's always like, why? What? Why are you painting your ass gold? Why do we have to throw that detail in there, Albert? It was at this point that Grace Shaw submitted the letters to the New York Times, who contacted the police. The cops swung. Why are you sending these to the Times? Just call the police. The cops swung by Fish's boarding house, but found that he had already moved out. Police did not have the resources to track an obscene letter writer all over New York, and they didn't even know if Fish had signed the tenancy papers with his real name. So the police asked Grace Shaw to set a trap for him by inviting him round to her place for a lovely bit of spanking at 2 p.m. on October the 28th. It's possible, however, that Fish smelled a rat because he didn't turn up. Yeah, that's pretty suspicious, right? The next day, on October the 29th, Fish sent Grace Shaw a brief polite letter thanking him for her interest in the position and telling her that James Bell would probably die of a heart attack if she spanked him, and that he was taking Bell to Virginia, where he was going to be cared for by a man instead of a woman. Fish also declared that Bobby would remain in Philadelphia, and again thought it was significant to mention that his caretaker was African American. Okay. After that, Fish cut off all communication. Had Fish shown up for his spanking, and this bizarre episode had instead resulted in Fish's arrest on October the 28th, 1934, it's likely that Fish would have been in jail or in the psych ward on November the 2nd when Detective William King's false story about a coke-addled tipster and a break in the Grace Budd case was planted in the newspaper. Fish would not have read it and not felt a sick compulsion to write the victim's mother, Delia Budd, telling her how he had murdered and eaten her daughter. Thus, Albert Fish would never have triggered the fateful sequence of events that came next. I told you that letter. It's the letter. He's writing down his crimes and sending them to the family of the victim. Come on, Albert. Less Saw, more CSI. At 10 a.m., on Monday, November 12, 1934, Edward Budd was at the police station showing Albert Fish's foul letter that recounted his murder and cannibalism of 10-year-old Grace to Detective William King. Nothing said in the handwritten letter marked it out as genuinely from the Grey Man. He'd used details that had been openly picked over in the newspapers for years. However, the cops had another writing sample to compare it to. Okay, I kind of thought, don't the police usually keep some stuff secret? So they don't tell you all of the details so that they'll know if something's genuine. And I thought the bringing of the cheese and the strawberries or whatever it was would be it's from him. But I guess not. On June the 2nd, 1928, the day before the abduction of Grace Budd, the Grey Man had sent a telegram to the Budd family claiming he was delayed on business in New Jersey. In the olden days, when you sent a telegram, you'd first write up a draft of what you wanted to say by hand. You'd give it to the telegraph operator, who would then send it via Morse code to another telegram office, where it was then copied down and delivered to the recipient. All the cops had to do was go to the telegram's point of origin and procure the original handwritten draft, which they had done way back in 1928. Oh, I was thinking they'd go back, it's 6 years later, and they still have that draft unless they've got a warehouse full of these. It's not happening. But of course, they collected it back in the day because they were, they knew this dude is the dude who's taken her. And hey presto, they had the Grey Man's writing sample. 6 years later, Detective William King dug it out of a filing cabinet and determined that the writing on the telegram and the Grey Man's vile letter in November the 11th, 1934 were a match. Next, Detective King closely examined the letter the Grey Man had posted on November the 11th. On the back of the envelope was the imprint of some kind of logo. It was a hexagon, and in each of the corners was a capital letter. Read clockwise, it spelled out NYPCBA, which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Below the logo was an address which the Grey Man had tried to conceal with the stroke of a pen, but Detective King took out his magnifying glass and was able to determine that the address was 627 Lexington Avenue. It was now time for Detective King to pay a visit to the headquarters of the NYPCBA. There, the detective questioned Arthur Ennis, who was president of the association. First, King asked if a man named Frank Howard, the alias Fish had given the buds, was an employee of the association in 1928, but a quick look at the records showed that no such man had ever worked there. Next, King went through 400 application forms filled out by the association's members, looking for a handwriting match to the Grey Man's letter, but none of the writing matched. The next day, on November the 13th, the NYPCBA convened an emergency meeting of its members. Detective King told the assembled crowd the situation and how it fit into the Grace Budd investigation. He gave a detailed description of the Grey Man. He also said that if anyone had taken stationery from the office, it was vital that they come forward. A part-time janitor named Lee Sikowski told King that in May of that year, he'd stolen some stationery and taken it home with him to his boarding house at 622 Lexington Avenue. King went over there, examined the register for a writing match to the Grey Man's, and asked people about a man of his description, but in both respects, King came up empty. Good for you, whoever that was, the dude who came forward. Because he's like, yeah, no, I stole it, but I know this is more important. Please don't get me in trouble. It's like, what was I saying in a previous episode? Where I was like, oh, it'd be nice if you go to the police and you tell them about a major crime, and in the same time implicating yourself in a small crime, that they leave you alone. And people in the comments were like, oh, Simon, that's so naive. And I'm like, oh, that sucks, because really you want people to record. Like, if you see a murder and you're not talking about the murder because you were slinging crack on the corner or whatever, that's not good. Like, the police should be like, all right, we're not going to investigate the drug dealing, but thanks for letting us know about the murder. Because if they just arrest them, then it's going to be a really bad precedent for, like, reporting more major crimes, right? It's how I feel about the whistleblowing thing in Edward Snowden. It's like Edward Snowden went forward and he was like, yo, guys, really illegal shit's going on. And then he gets in a bunch of trouble for it. And it's like, wait, he's a whistleblower. He should have protection. Like, one half of the government, there should be separation of powers. What the fuck's going on? On November the 14th, King questioned Lee Sikowski again, and the janitor remembered that when he stole the stationery back in May, he'd been living at a different boarding house, room number 7 at 200 East 52nd Street. Sikowski also said that he left a lot of the stationery at the boarding house when he moved away, left sitting on a wooden shelf above the bed. Detective King raced round to 200 East 52nd Street. There, the detective questioned the landlady of the boarding house, Frieda Schneider, and gave her a detailed description of the Grey Man. She said that description perfectly fit an old man who until recently had lived in room number 7. He moved out on November the 11th, the same day the Grey Man had posted his letter. Next, Detective King examined the guest register. Sure enough, the writing of the Grey Man's letter matched a signature in the logbook. A signature of one Albert H. Fish. Oh, the game is coming up. Let's go. Frieda Schneider told King that the old man received money from his son John Fish, who lived in North Carolina, working for the Civilian Conservation Corps. Every month, John would send his father a check for $25 or $558 in today's money, and occasionally Albert Fish would ask Schneider to cash it. And because Fish had only moved out 3 days before, on November the 11th, John Fish did not know his father's new address. Thus, Albert Fish was expecting the November check to be sent to the 52nd Street boarding house, and he had asked Frieda Schneider to hold on to it for him until he could swing by and pick it up. King immediately put the boarding house under police surveillance. He also telephoned the Civilian Conservation Corps in North Carolina and told the financial officer to alert him when the paychecks were distributed. He got the New York Postal Service to be on the lookout for any mail with a recipient called Albert Fish, and he told the Chauffeurs Association to hang on to any mail in their envelopes returned to their address as undeliverable. Indeed, later that week, the association turned over a letter to King addressed to a Vincent Burke, vice president of a New York nudist colony. The letter was from a man claiming to be a nudist from Washington, D.C., and requesting permission to join Burke's club. The letter was signed one James W. Pell, and the handwriting was a match for Albert Fish. Unfortunately, November came and went, and Albert Fish never showed up at the 52nd Street boarding house to pick up his check. King was forced to lift the surveillance from the place, and then at 12 p.m. on December the 13th, King received a telephone call from the landlady, Frieda Schneider. It immediately became clear that she was play-acting on the phone, telling King that one Mr. Albert Fish had arrived and was hoping to pick up his check. King told her, "That is some sly shit. Well done." King told her to keep Fish busy at the boarding house, slammed down the phone, and raced up to 52nd Street in a cop car. Let's go! Let's go! When King arrived, Frieda Schneider was waiting anxiously outside the building. She told King that she'd offered Fish a cup of tea and to put him upstairs in one of the rooms to sit down while he drank it. King went upstairs and finally laid eyes on the man. He was exactly as he was described, grey in appearance and demeanor. Detective King asked the man if his name was Albert Fish. The grey man replied, yes. King then formally requested that Fish come down to the station for questioning in relation to the 1928 disappearance of Grace Budd. Fish agreed placidly. Then Fish reached into his pocket, pulled out a razor blade, and attacked King. The detective grabbed Fish by the wrist and disarmed him. Then King placed Albert Fish under arrest. The sadistic child predator's 47-year reign of terror was over at fucking last. Let's go. Let's get him in the chair. I'm thirsty for his blood. The Werewolf of Wysteria. Upon questioning at the police station, Fish admitted to writing the vile letter to Delia Budd on November the 11th, the letter to the president of the nudist colony, and even the telegram signed by Frank Howard sent to the Budd family on June the 2nd, 1928, but Fish denied kidnapping Grace Budd and denied ever going to the Budd residence. King threatened Fish with collecting a raft of witnesses who could identify him, including several members of the Budd family and the other young man, Willie Corman. At this point, Fish confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd and confirmed that it happened exactly as described in his letter to the mother. Fish then freely gave Detective King a detailed confession. Yeah, it's like, no, it wasn't me. It's like, bro, you know how many people saw your face? Like, old Delia or whatever. She's identified many people before and she's not reliable, but there's a whole host of other people who saw you, man. And it wasn't that long ago, dude. You're f***ed. You're f***ed, mate. Let's go. After recounting the abduction, murder, and cannibalism, Fish said that he returned to Wysteria Cottage on June the 7th, 1928. There he gathered the dismembered remains of Grace Budd's body from the room where he'd killed her, threw the legs out of the window into the backyard, and carried the victim's torso downstairs. He retrieved the victim's head from the outhouse. He concealed all of the body parts behind an old stone wall at the back of the yard. He did not bother to bury them. Fish stated that over the next 6 years, he returned to Wysteria Cottage to relive the murder 4 or 5 times, which is pretty typical behavior of serial killers. But he said he never looked over the stone wall at the actual body. The last time Fish visited Wysteria College was 2 months prior, in October 1934, the same day he tried to abduct 6-year-old Marion Leferd, a block away from the cottage. When Detective King asked Fish why he killed Grace Budd, the old man answered, "You know, I could never account for why." When asked why Fish had used the Sophers Association's envelope when he wrote his letter to Delia Budd, Fish said that he was in a room on 52nd Street, standing on a chair trying to kill a cockroach on the wall when he saw the envelopes on the shelf over the bed. Detective King later remarked to the press that it was staggering to think that if Fish had not been trying to kill a cockroach, that it maybe never have been caught. Well, it's not the cockroach. It's his own stupid, writing that letter. What are you doing, idiot? The same day, at 5 p.m., December the 13th, the police drove Albert Fish out to Wysteria Cottage in Irvington to locate Grace Budd's body. They arrived just before 7 p.m. Because it was winter, darkness had already fallen. Fish and the officers made their way over to the back of the yard at Wysteria Cottage. Working by lamplight, the officers used a shovel borrowed from a neighbor down the street to remove a layer of topsoil behind the stone wall. While the body parts had been moved around by the elements and interfered with by wildlife, after an hour's work, the police had located most of the bones, the skull, and the tattered clothes of 10-year-old Grace Budd. The little girl's remains were gathered in a picnic basket. Excavations continued the following morning. In the woods behind the cottage, they found a pile of children's shoes, none of which belonged to Grace Budd. Meanwhile, Fish was returned to the police station, where around 10 p.m. he resumed his interrogation, this time led by the assistant district attorney. At 1 a.m., Grace's father, Albert Budd, and her brother, Edward Budd, were brought down to the station to identify the suspect. Delia Budd was not included due to her past tendency to give false identifications in her desperate attempt to find her daughter. Albert and Edward Budd confirmed that Fish was the man who identified himself as Frank Howard and had taken Grace off to a birthday party at a bogus address. Edward Budd was so enraged that he lunged at Fish and had to be pulled off him. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Fish's interrogation resumed. He was again asked why he killed Grace Budd, and he replied, "I don't know. It just occurred to me. The temptation just came over me. That's all I can say. I can't account for it. I don't understand." Yeah, you're a psychopath. He's just like classic psychopath. Officers pelted Fish with questions about a number of other unsolved child murder cases. Among the names the police put forward were Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney. Fish denied having anything to do with them. Meanwhile, on December the 14th, the story had hit the newspapers. Although the full extent of Fish's crimes hadn't yet become clear, the Grace Budd story was enough to write dozens of salacious articles designed to sell copies to a horrified but insanely curious public. The inevitable inaccurate references to Jack the Ripper came thick and fast. Yet, what would be the nickname given to this new killer? Every publication was jockeying for position, trying to find one that stuck. The New York Daily News compared him to German serial killer Fritz Hamann, the Vampire of Hanover, and floated the nickname the Vampire of Bluckton. The Daily Mirror took the scattershot approach, calling Albert Fish the Ogre of Murder Lodge, the Vampire Man, the orgiastic fiend, the modern Bluebeard, the age thrill killer, and the Werewolf of Wysteria in a single article. Having hurled enough It was the Werewolf of Wysteria that stuck. And although Albert Fish was popularly known as the Grey Man and the Bogeyman over the years, due to the witness testimony of Anna McDowell and Billy Beaton respectively, it was actually thanks to the dramatic reading of the name The Werewolf of Wysteria by Norm MacDonald on a 2011 podcast that made it the sobriquet by which Albert Fish is known by most people in the 21st century today. That's interesting. I definitely knew him as the Grey Man. Like when I've seen him around, like on the podcasts or on YouTube or whatever, I always see Albert Fish the Grey Man. But the Werewolf of Wysteria, until this point, David, I thought it was the title that you had given him. On December the 16th, Albert Fish was transferred to the New York City prison, an early 20th century building that looked like a French chateau nicknamed The Tombs. There, Fish continued to be interrogated and proved uncooperative. Meanwhile, police permitted Fish to write letters to people and speak to members of the press in the hopes that Fish would let slip new information. Indeed, Fish reveled in the press attention, regularly holding court in the visitors' room of the prison, talking to journalists through a screen of chicken wire. The chaps at the Mirror, having interviewed Fish on the 17th, concluded that he was a quote-unquote vicious moron. Fish's eldest son, Albert Jr., was also approached by the media shortly after the story broke. He called his father a skunk and said that it had nothing to do with him. The rest of Fish's children, at least nominally, stood by him at this time, corresponding with him while he was in prison. Fish's daughter, Gertrude DeMarco, initially refused to believe any of the charges against him were true. For his part, Fish inquired after his children's financial well-being and also claimed that he wanted to spare them grief, so he refused to allow them to come to the Tombs to visit him. Yeah, I mean, the children, their mum ran away and he raised them. They didn't see his crazy dark side or put it together. So you'd be like, no shot. No shot. What are you talking about? This is obviously wrong. You've obviously confused him with someone else, and we'll just see how this plays out, and then he'll be free. Because you have no idea what's going on. Good Lord. On December the 19th, the police were approached by Brooklyn trolley operators Joseph Meehan and Anthony Barone. They had come forward after seeing Fish's face in the newspapers. The two men said that it had been Albert Fish on the trolley that night, on the 11th of February 1927, with a boy they felt was sure was Billy Gaffney, whose abduction had never been solved. On December the 20th, police questioned Fish about Gaffney, but he continued to deny any wrongdoing. Police tossed Fish in a lineup, and both Meehan and Barone identified him as the man they saw. Uh-oh. At first I'd be like, yeah, it's just eyewitness testimony. I mean, how is that going to play out? So they're like, oh yeah, they'll just do a lineup. Be like, that dude, he's the one. And now he's That same day, Staten Island resident Hans Keel identified Fish as the man who had tried to abduct his daughter and later tried to sleep in his barn in 1924, a few days before the Staten Island murder of Frances McDonald. Keel's wife and daughter later identified him as well. Fish attempted to cover his face when Keel's wife and daughter had approached his cell. Although Fish admitted that he was on Staten Island in July 1924 at a painting job, he denied having anything to do with Frances McDonald's murder. Wait a second. Wait 1 second. That doesn't make... something just twigged in my mind about the identification. So these trolley operators, they saw his face in the paper, were like, that's the guy, and then the police do a lineup, and they say, that's the guy. They could just be identifying the guy they saw in the papers. Right? How's that work? On December the 21st, Fish was transferred to the Westchester County Jail to await trial. On December the 28th, Fish was x-rayed at Grasslands Hospital, where doctors found no fewer than 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. Meanwhile, Fish was examined by 2 psychologists who concluded that despite Fish having numerous sexual disorders and paraphilias, he was, by the legal definition of the day, completely sane. But the legal definition of the day really just boiled down to whether you were capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong, a fairly low bar. Nevertheless, on January the 7th, 1935, Fish's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Success or failure at the trial was going to make the difference between Fish being executed or spending the rest of his life in a mental asylum. Oh, come on, let's go. We can get him executed, can't we, please? I get the feeling he gets executed, right? Come on.
My people want blood.
While Fish was in prison, he spent most of his days writing letters to people, obscene and not obscene, along with reading his favorite passages from the Bible. One day, when a Catholic priest had come to the prison to give Sunday Mass, a guard had to enter Fish's cell and stop him from masturbating to the spoken rhythm of the liturgy. Bro. On February the 25th, 1935, Fish kept demanding that the guards give him a box of matches so that he could light his cigarettes. Typically, a guard would light Fish's cigarettes through the bars of his cell. The guard entered Fish's cell and searched it, trying to find out why the old man wanted his own matches. And sure enough, the guard found a bottle of booze and a clump of cotton wool that Fish had intended to stick up his arse and light on fire. The guard had no idea how Fish had obtained either item. On March the 10th, Fish found a chicken bone in the soup he had been served, sharpened it to a fine point, and started cutting himself on the chest and stomach. Attracted by his moans of pleasure, the guards intervened and took it off him. On March the 5th, Fish's lawyer tried to convince the district attorney that if Fish were given a life sentence instead of execution, Fish would submit himself to medical experimentation for the rest of his life. Doctors and psychologists could study him and figure out why he was a sadistic child killer, thus allowing experts to further understand the disorders that drive such people in the future. The district attorney rejected this offer, saying, quote, "As long as Fish is alive, he is a menace." Yes, dear, yes! I like that vibe, let's go. The flesh of their sons and daughters. The trial of Albert Fish for the murder of Grace Budd opened on March the 11th, 1935 at the Westchester Supreme Court building in White Plains, New York, with the Right Honorable Judge Close presiding. The first day was devoted to the appointment of the jury, who were mostly middle-aged men with children, save for one jury member who was young and engaged to be married. Albert Fish slept through much of the proceedings. The Mirror called him, quote, "a corpse insecurely propped up in a chair." In the afternoon of the second day, the prosecutor, Elbert Gallagher, reviewed the evidence against Fish, including his letter to Delia Budd describing the crime and his own confession to the police. As for the defendant's claim of insanity, Gallagher said that Fish knew what he was doing, knew the murder was wrong, and did it anyway. Gallagher said that while Fish was quote-unquote sexually abnormal, he was competent enough to lie on several occasions to the Budd family and to arrange a second location to kill the girl. He was not undergoing psychosis. He was perfectly lucid when he killed a young girl for his own sexual gratification. Yes, that's exactly what happened. For his defense attorney, Albert Fisher managed to secure a fancy Dan lawyer named James Dempsey. Fish didn't have the money to pay him, but Dempsey took on the case because of the renown the headlines would get him. Dempsey focused entirely on the details of Fish's life, the trauma it endured in the orphanage, the mental break of his wife leaving him with 6 kids and no household possessions, the obvious decline in his mental health as evidenced by the nail-studded paddles and taint needles. Oh, that still makes me shiver, bro. And the fact that he thought God was talking to him. Dempsey pointed out that as a professional house painter, Fish almost certainly came into contact with lead-based paints and got lead poisoning, which also contributed to his mental deterioration. Dempsey criticized the doctors at Bellevue, where Fish was confined in 1930, for judging him sane and letting him go. Dempsey also claimed that at the time of the murder of Grace Budd, Fish's children had mostly grown up and left home, making Fish feel adrift and driving him to look for a new child with whom he could form a connection. The desire got contorted by his obvious mental illness and resulted in abduction, murder, and cannibalism. Delia, Edward, and Albert Budd all took the stand and recounted the events of June 1928 and pointed Fish out in the courtroom. Albert Budd, Grace's father, was so upset recalling the events and coming face to face with Fish that he burst into tears and sobbed. According to the newspapers, nobody in the courtroom made a sound. Detective King then took the stand and described how he traced Fish's whereabouts and arrested him. Under cross-examination, James Dempsey tried to make King admit that he'd beaten Fish's confession to the murder out of him, and King denied this. On the third day, March the 13th, Detective King took the stand again and described Fish's confession in gruesome detail before describing the discovery of Grace's remains in the backyard of Wysteria Cottage. Over the emphatic objections of the defense, 2 bailiffs brought Grace's bones, piled into a grocery box, into the courtroom to show the jury. The judge allowed this. Dempsey was so incensed that he called for a mistrial, and the judge immediately denied the motion. What's he hoping for? The judge said it was okay, and then he's like, "I want a mistrial, judge. You made a bad decision." Guess what, bitch? Another bad decision then. Denied. Carry on. He's gonna fry. The following day, 2 dentists confirmed the skull found at Wysteria Cottage belonged to Grace Budd. The rest of the day was spent questioning various police officers to confirm the events of Fish's arrest, confession, and the discovery of the body. On the 5th day, March the 15th, the prosecution rested its case. The defense then called Fish's eldest son, Albert Jr., to the stand. The estranged son did not look at his father once while he recounted the numerous acts of masochism and mental illness that he'd witnessed from his father over the years, including the paddles, the pins, the standing on top of a hill shouting, "I am Christ," and hallucinating that he was being stalked by a giant black cat. Then the defense called Dr. Roy Duckworth, who testified to the x-ray which proved Fish had shoved at least 29 needles into his taint. Then Fish's daughter, Gertrude DeMarco, was called to the stand, and she recounted the apparent cruelty of her mother's leaving, her father's gentle and kind nature in raising them, and the deterioration of his mental health over the years. The sixth day of the trial continued to explore how Albert Fish had been insane for decades, far beyond the events of Grace Budd's murder. Firstly, the court went over Albert Fish's many obscene letters to women. The subject was deemed so graphic that the judge banned female onlookers from the courtroom. The defense also called Fish's former landlady, Helen Carlson, who testified that Fish had sexually propositioned her multiple times, so she had evicted him. The defense attorney spent an inordinate amount of time establishing that Fish had taken a massive shit on the floor of his bedroom when he moved out. Okay. Mary Nichols. We really need to establish that one. Mary Nichols, daughter of one of the widows Fish fraudulently married in 1930, then took to the stand to describe how when she was 12, Fish had Mary and her siblings smack him in the arse with a heavy stick as part of a game obviously designed to satisfy Fish's masochism. Mary Nichols also recounted an event where Fish shoved several needles under his fingernails in front of her and her sister. Fish's eldest daughter, Anna Collins, described finding her father rolled up in a carpet, claiming John the Apostle was talking to him. Then Anna's daughter, Gloria, described an incident where she had caught her grandfather bent over the couch flogging himself. Fish's other son, Eugene, testified that once he found his father naked in someone else's apartment trying to paint the windows with a dry brush, and a few months prior to the murder of Grace Budd, how Eugene had discovered Fish stabbing himself in the taint with needles. Bruh. I mean, he's clearly wacko, but he's not. He knows what he's doing is evil. He knows he's an evil man. The seventh day of the trial consisted of a defense psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Wertham, emphatically asserting that Albert Fish was insane and not responsible for his actions. It was this testimony that was the most shocking of the entire trial. In their sessions together, Wertham had managed to drag out of Fish details about his past that not only hinted at lifelong mental illness stemming from his childhood abuse, but also indicated that Albert Fish's predatory behavior towards children was not confined to the murder of Grace Budd. Wertham testified that Fish had told him of many acts of rape and torture that he'd committed over the years. Fish's children, present in the courtroom, sat in shock as they heard these details for the first time, and some of them broke down in tears. Wertham's defense testimony likely backfired, since the revelation that Fish had been a sadistic child predator for the better part of half a century poisoned the jury further against him, and increased the appeal of putting Fish to death rather than sending him to a mental institution. Defense, did you not prepare your witness? Because goddamn, what are you doing? Let's put him on the stand. He's just going to say that, no, he's mental because he's been a child predator for half a century. What do you think that's going to do to the jury? Are you insane? On the eighth day of the trial, Wertham took the stand again. Defense attorney James Dempsey said he wanted to ask Wertham a, quote, hypothetical question. James Dempsey then read Wertham a question that was 15,000 words in length and took an hour and 15 minutes to read, recounting Fish's entire life. At the end of this absurdly long biographical preface to the question, Dempsey said, "Now, Doctor, assuming the truth of the facts as stated in the foregoing hypothetical question, what, in your opinion, is the mental condition of the defendant today?" Dr. Wertham replied with 3 words: "He is insane." Rarely has such a ridiculous bit of pantomime ever been performed, or more spectacularly, fallen flat in a courtroom. Excellent. The prosecutor, Albert Gallagher, then cross-examined Dr. Wertham, pouring doubt on the psychiatrist's assertion that Fish did not know right from wrong. Wertham replied, "To really know right from wrong requires empathy. You have to feel what is right and wrong. This defendant is suffering from a mental disease. He is so mixed up about the question of punishment, of sin, of atonement, of religion, of torture, that he is in a particularly bad state to know the difference between right and wrong. He is even worse off than that, because he actually has a perverted, a distorted, if you will, an insane knowledge of right and wrong." Gallagher then asked why Wertham was so sure that Fish hadn't made up his tortured life story. Wertham replied that Fish stabbed himself in the groin with needles and, quote, "I have never seen a fantasy show up on an X-ray. After all, a child is dead. It was no fantasy when he told me he killed this girl." Gallagher then put up 4 expert witnesses, including Menas Gregory, who had judged Fish sane at Bellevue. The other experts were a prosecution psychiatrist, the physician at the Tombs prison, and an expert on coprophilia. All 4 witnesses asserted that while Albert Fish had numerous unsavory fetishes, especially by the standards of the 1930s, those paraphilias in and of themselves did not denote mental illness to the point that Fish didn't know right from wrong. Fish knew he was committing crimes against children. He just didn't care because he wanted sexual gratification. The judge then called a recess for the day. Tomorrow was the final day of the trial, where the jury would hear the concluding statements of the defense and prosecution. At this point, Albert Fish passed his attorney, James Dempsey, a note which read, "Before you sum up, read the jury Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 9. The Bible passage in question is, And I will cause them to eat the flesh of their sons and daughters, and they shall eat each other's flesh in the siege and distress which their enemies seeking to take their lives inflict on them. Oh my God, Bible. James Dempsey ignored this advice. Yes. To kill a masochist. The 10th and final day of the trial of Albert Fish began at 9:15 a.m. on Friday the 22nd of March 1935. The defense went first. Dempsey spoke for 2 hours. He acknowledged the brutality of Grace's murder, but underlined the fact that Fish was insane. Dempsey said that he could not believe that a jury composed of the fathers of children would convict a man who had loved 6 children of his own. He said that if Bellevue had diagnosed Fish as insane in 1930, he'd be locked up right now and there would be no question of sending him to his death today. He then made the argument that if Mr. and Mrs. Budd had not consented to their daughter going off with a crazy person, she would be alive today, thus shifting the blame onto them. Bro, that's the biggest victim blame in history. Dempsey also argued that a man who would cannibalize a child could not be judged as anything other than insane. He closed by saying, quote, "Remember Albert Fish, and when he was helpless and defenseless and pleaded with you for his life, that you said, 'Let him live or let him die.' And if you said, 'Let him die,' may he who has breathed into your nostrils the breath of life judge you more mercifully than you judged this maniac." Albert Fish began to cry when he heard these final words. This guy is an I don't know what he was doing calling that psychologist to the stand. He was like, yeah, no, he's been a predator for 50 years. That was a dumb move. But this closing statement is very good. I mean, I still think he's insane. He's not insane. He knows right from wrong. And even if he doesn't, it's because he's a psychopath. It doesn't matter. He killed some children. Let's send him to the chair. Then the prosecutor, Albert Gallagher, stood up and delivered his summation, which also lasted 2 hours. He opened by saying, "Mr. Dempsey, in his closing remarks, asked you to remember certain things about the defenseless Mr. Fish. Gentlemen, I want you to remember the defenseless little innocent Grace Budd, as she kicked and screamed in the springtime of her life and said she would tell her mama." Gallagher then went on to coldly and clinically review the facts of the case. He repeated the arguments that while Fish was a sexual deviant, he was mentally lucid when he schemed to abduct and murder a child. The jury merely had to determine whether Fish knew right from wrong. Gallagher also denied the allegations that Fish was hearing voices from God, saints, or angels. He was a sexual sadist, a pervert, a paedophile. Pure and simple, Gallagher closed by saying, "Gentlemen, the people leave this case in your hands, knowing that whatever you do, you will do right by the people of this county, of this state, and by the defendant." That afternoon, at 3 p.m., the jury began their deliberations. At 8:27 p.m., after 5.5 hours, the jury filed back into the room, having reached a verdict. Guilty. Albert Fish slumped in his chair, but otherwise showed no reaction. It later came out that the jury unanimously believed that Fish was insane, but they wanted to execute him anyway. Yeah, ultimately, the jury could just do whatever the fuck they want. It's like, yeah, he's insane, but guess what? If I'm guilty anyway, that guy, execute the insane bastard. On Sunday, March the 24th, Fish confessed to abducting, torturing, murdering, and cannibalizing 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in February 1927. On Monday, the 25th of March, Judge Close sentenced Albert Fish to death via the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. Fish listened to the sentence, gave a cheerful little wave, and shouted, "Thank you, Judge." Fish said to the New York Daily News, quote, "What a thrill it will be to die in the electric chair. It will be the supreme thrill, the one I haven't tried yet." That evening, while at Sing Sing, Fish confessed to the rape and the murder of Frances McDonald in July 1924. This is the last murder that Fish admitted to, though police reported to the district attorney that they felt fairly confident that they had evidence to prove Fish had committed at least 15 other child murders. Additionally, Fish had made numerous other offhand statements to Dr. Wharton, prison guards, police officers, and various correspondents that he had committed many more crimes, and that his victim count was in the triple digits. Today, police would keep a man like Fish under interrogation for months and months until they had dragged out every detail of every single murder, rape, abduction, cannibalization. In the 1930s, however, the police and the district attorney were happy to wash their hands of the whole thing since Fish had already been sentenced to fry for the murder of Grace Budd. We shall therefore never know just how many children and teenagers Fish may have harmed during his 47 years as a sadistic predator. On March the 28th, Fish carved an 8-inch cross into his abdomen by using a sharpened pork bone that he'd lifted from his dinner plate. On April the 3rd, 1935, Elizabeth Gaffney, mother of Billy Gaffney, visited Albert Fish at Sing Sing. She had declared that she would not believe Fish had murdered her son until she had heard the admission from his own lips. Fish said he would not speak to her and began to cry. After 2 hours of Fish refusing to answer any of Elizabeth Gaffney's questions, she gave up and went home. She remained unsure whether it was Fish who had abducted her son. If it was someone else, that at least kept the hope that Billy was still alive, or at any rate hadn't been subjected to the gruesome death that Fish claimed to have inflicted. His body was never found. James Dempsey tried to appeal the guilty verdict, alleging mistrial due to the display of Grace Budd's remains in the courtroom and the judge's obvious hostility towards the defense. On November 26, 1935, the Court of Appeals upheld the guilty verdict, and Fish's execution was scheduled for January 16, 1936. The day of his execution, Albert Fish ate a lunch consisting of T-bone steak that already had the bone pre-removed to avoid another display of self-mutilation. At dinner, his final meal was roast chicken, which also had all the bones removed. At 10:30, he got T-bone steak and chicken. I think the final meal thing is super weird, and it isn't something that should be done. But why did he get steak and then what he wanted? At 10:30 p.m., Albert Fish prayed with the prison chaplain. At 11 p.m., he was escorted down the hallway to the execution chamber. His face was pale, and he was uttering a prayer under his breath. At 11:06 p.m., Albert Fish entered the chamber and was strapped into the electric chair. The switch was pulled, and over 2,000 volts of electricity ripped through him. At 11:09, Albert Fish was declared dead. His last words were reported as, "I don't even know why I'm here." Yes, you fucking do, Albert. And you deserve to be there, and you deserve to have been executed. Good. Good riddance. Dismembered appendices. Number 1. A myth has circulated that at Albert Fish's execution, the pins lodged in his pelvic region short-circuited the electric chair, making it necessary for two pulls of the switch to kill Fish, meaning he died in extreme agony. The claim is not true, but it persisted because, quite frankly, many people wished that it was true. Yes, indeed. 2. There have not been many high-profile film depictions of Albert Fish, largely due to the difficulty of depicting the rape, torture, and murder of children on screen. One biographical film called The Grey Man was released in 2007. It didn't have a high budget, and it opened to mixed reviews. My honest appraisal is meh. There are more creative ways of telling this horrific story. Number 3. Albert Fish was the most famous rendition of the late comedian Norm Macdonald's joke, where he grimly listed his crimes in a dramatic fashion before declaring, "This guy was a real jerk." Number 4. Only 3 confirmed murders have been attributed to Albert Fish, but as mentioned earlier, the number of children he raped and tortured could be well over 100, with one claim indicating it was over 400 in a 47-year reign of terror. The number of children Fish murdered could be as high as 24, which would place Albert Fish 5th in the list of America's most prolific serial killers after John Wayne Gacy and Juan Corona, and the first in the list of America's child slayers. Final. Number 5. An intriguing report was made to the police in December 1934 by Brooklyn resident Benjamin Eisman, who claims that on July 11, 1924, the same day as the attempted abduction of Beatrice Keel and 3 days before the murder of Frances McDowell, 16-year-old Eisman was sat on a bench in Battery Park in Manhattan when he was approached by Albert Fish. Eisman claimed that Fish offered to hire him to help with a painting job that he was doing on Staten Island. Fish and Eisman boarded a ferry, arrived at St. George, and caught a train for half an hour to the south side of the island. There, Fish led Eisman to an abandoned shack. Fish told Eisman to wait outside while he got his tools. While he waited, Eisman claimed that he was approached by an African-American man who said, quote, "Listen, son, you better get out of here. A lot of kids have gone in there and never come back out." Eisman followed the advice and fled. This report was made shortly after Fish's arrest and a full 3 months prior to Fish admitting to the murder of Frances McDowell. It implicates Fish was victimizing a lot more children than the confirmed cases would indicate. Yeah, and I think we all know that he was. And also, why didn't that dude call the police? Anyway, this has been an episode, a long and brutal episode of The Casual Criminalist. Thank you for being here. If you enjoy the show, say that, it's a bit weird, isn't it? But leave a review. Thank you very much. If you're watching on YouTube, hello. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.